Biggles' Secret Mission by W.E. Johns. A penny for your thoughts. Captain Algernon Lacey, late of the Royal Flying Corps, looked across the room at his friend, Major James Bigglesworth, more often known as Biggles, with a twinkle in his eye. Biggles started out of his reverie. He smiled. "You're over-generous. I don't think they're worth as much." "You seem to be cogitating with considerable concentration," observed Ginger Hebblethwaite, their protégé, who was passing a wet afternoon pasting up some photographs in an album. "I'll tell you what I was thinking," growled Biggles. "I was thinking, what a queer thing coincidence is. This morning, who should I barge into but Tom Lowry? You remember Tom, Algy? He came to 266 Squadron just before the armistice. He's a squadron leader now, stationed at Singapore. Naturally, we ended up at Simpson's for lunch, and while we were disposing of our steak and kidney pudding, he started to tell me about Ramsay, his wireless mechanic. Apparently Tom thought a lot of Ramsay, and used to take him in the back seat of his machine during air operations. And during one of these flights, Ramsay picked up a wireless message out of the blue. Now, Tom had just got as far as that with his story when who should walk in through the door of the restaurant but Jerry Legshaw from the Air Ministry. Naturally, Jerry joined us, and Tom carried on telling me about Ramsay. Is that all clear? Perfectly. Good. Well, it appears that this message Ramsay picked up was an SOS from a steamship, giving the ship's position and concluding with the words, "Weather fine, sea slight." Ramsay, in taking down the message, which came through, of course, in Morse, had spelt it W-H-E-T-H-E-R. Tom looked at it and said to Ramsay, "You should be able to spell better than that. You mean W-E-A-T-H-E-R. Said Ramsay, all hot and peeved, "No, sir. The word I took was W-H-E-T-H-E-R. Whereupon Tom tore him off a strip. Now, as Tom was telling me his story, Jerry, who'd been listening with interest, blurted out, "But Ramsay was right. I picked up the Shenandoah's message from the Air Ministry, and the word weather was spelt W-H-E-T-H-E-R. I can vouch for it." At that, Tom gave him an odd look and said, "What are you talking about? I never said anything about the Shenandoah. I was talking about the Queen of Alati that went down in the Indian Ocean about 6 months ago." "Well, that's weird," said Jerry. "I thought naturally that you were referring to the Shenandoah, which hit an uncharted reef in the Indian Ocean and went down with all hands about 5 months ago." "Now, there were no survivors from the Queen of Alati either," put in Tom casually. And with that the conversation turned to something else, and no more was said about it. "Strange," murmured Algy. "Strange," cried Biggles. "It's more than strange. The chances against two educated men misspelling the same word, almost at the same time and place, and in practically similar circumstances, must be so remote as to leave one no alternative but to assume that they were one and the same man." "But how could that be possible? Surely the operator on the Queen of Alati, which went down first, was drowned." "Yes, his body was picked up by one of the ships that raced to the rescue after the SOS went out." "And the wireless operator on the Shenandoah drowned too." "Then that must be the end of the story," suggested Ginger in a disappointed tone of voice. Biggles smiled mysteriously. "Not quite. Since the Queen of Alati and the Shenandoah went down, 2 other ships have been lost with all hands, also in the Indian Ocean. Both sent out SOSs, but disappeared, leaving no trace behind." "Was the word weather misspelt in those cases too?" "Ah, that I don't know. In each case, the SOS was picked up by one vessel only. So I contacted the wireless operator, and he confirmed that he had taken the SOS from one of the ships, and the word weather had been spelt W-H-E-T-H-E-R. He thought it odd at the time. Algy thrust his hands deep into his trouser pockets and stared at Biggles for a moment in silence. "By the anti-clockwise propeller of Icarus," exclaimed Algy. "That certainly is a most amazing coincidence." "Coincidence, my foot," snorted Biggles. "There's no coincidence about it. Those 3 messages were sent out by the same man." "But how could 3 dead men, miles away from each other, be one and the same?" Biggles shook his head sadly. "Don't ask me. I'm no good at riddles. But I should like to know what cargo those ships were carrying." "Why not ask Colonel Raymond at Scotland Yard? I don't suppose he'd know offhand, but he'd jolly soon find out for you if you asked him." "That's a good idea. Let's try." Biggles reached for the phone and dialed police headquarters at Scotland Yard. Almost immediately he was talking to Colonel Raymond. Suddenly the others saw his expression change. From casual curiosity it became deadly serious. Finally, Biggles hung up the receiver and eyed the others gravely. He spoke slowly. "The Queen of Alati was loaded with military aeroplanes for the Australian government. The Shenandoah was bound for Singapore with Rolls-Royce Kestrel engines, machine guns and ammunition. The Alice Clare was bound for Shanghai, with munitions for the British forces there. The 4th ship was coming home from Madras with a lot of bar gold. Raymond is on his way here now." A low whistle escaped Algy's lips. A few minutes later, Colonel Raymond walked into the room. After shaking hands all round, he sat down and turned a questioning eye on Biggles. "Well," he said, "what do you know about this, eh?" Biggles shrugged his shoulders. "Nothing. I've been guessing, that's all." "And what have you guessed?" "Just that it would suit some people remarkably well if all British ships bound for the Far East and the Antipodes, with armament, never got there." Raymond stared. "That's not a bad guess, either. The Sea Lords are worried to death about it. So is the Air Council. But they know nothing, only that these ships have disappeared. The public know nothing about the ships carrying munitions. Naturally, we don't let it get into the newspapers. But come on, this is very serious indeed. What strange chance led you to the trail?" Briefly, Biggles told his old wartime chief what he had told the others earlier in the afternoon. When he had finished, Colonel Raymond got up and began pacing up and down the room. Suddenly he stopped and faced Biggles squarely. "Bigglesworth, have you formed any ideas about this business?" "I've hardly had time yet, but my first impression is that some foreign power, with a base in the Indian Ocean, is sinking every ship which their spies inform them is carrying munitions to our forces in the Far East. They take control of our ship's wireless room before the captain or crew suspect what's going to happen, tap out a false SOS, and then sink her, taking care that there are no survivors." The colonel suddenly snatched up his hat. "I must get round to the Admiralty. They must know about this. They'll send a flotilla of destroyers and—" "Tell the enemy, whoever it is, that their scheme is discovered," smiled Biggles, with a hint of sarcasm in his voice. "Why not write to them and have done with it? The result would be the same. All you'll meet with will be suave faces and pained protests." Colonel Raymond bit his lip. "Perhaps you're right. That's for the Admiralty to decide. You stay where you are. You'll hear from me again presently." Before Biggles could reply, he had gone out and slammed the door. "You see what comes of nosy parkering in matters that don't concern you," Biggles told Ginger sadly. "Let it be a lesson to you. If anyone asked my opinion as to the location of the enemy base, I should say it would be within 100 miles of this point." Biggles carefully stuck a pin into the big atlas that lay open on the table at a double page entitled "The Indian Ocean and the Dutch East Indies." 4 red ink spots marked the last known position of the ill-fated vessels, and from these, lead pencil lines radiated out to the nearest points of land, each line being accompanied by the distance in miles, written in Biggles' small, neat handwriting. "Magui Archipelago," read Ginger aloud, craning his neck to see the words that appeared on the map at the point which Biggles had indicated with the pin. "You think the enemy base is there?" "Well, just look at it and consider the possibilities," replied Biggles. "Hundreds of islands and islets, lying at a nice, convenient distance from the mainland, 30 or 40 miles on average, and spread along the coast for a distance of nearly 300 miles. The islands are rocky, well wooded, with magnificent natural harbours. What more could a mystery ship ask for?" "I've never heard of the place before," confessed Ginger. "Are the islands inhabited?" "Generally speaking, no, although I believe there is a race called Salones, who wander about from island to island in glorified canoes which they make their homes. Queer spot. Sort of place where anything could happen. Do you remember Gilson, Algy? That political officer at Rangoon? I have a vague recollection of his telling me that the islands are infested with crocodiles and all sorts of wild beasts that swim over from the mainland of Burma and Siam. He told me—" The shrill summons of a telephone had interrupted him. "Who the dickens is this, I wonder?" "Oh, hello, Colonel Raymond." "Yes, sir?" "What's that, dine with you?" "Delighted, of course. Where?" "Oh dear, that isn't in my line." "Right you are, sir. I'll be ready. Goodbye." He hung up the receiver and turned to the others. "He's picking me up in his car in half an hour. Ever heard of a place called Lottison House?" "Heard of it?" cried Algy. "Great Scott! Lord Lottison is one of the head lads at the Foreign Office." Biggles started. "Jumping mackerel," he breathed. "Of course he is. I thought the name seemed familiar. It begins to look as if my confounded curiosity has got me into a nice mess. Well, I shall have to go and get ready." "Did he say anything about bringing us?" inquired Ginger, frowning. "No, not a word," grinned Biggles. "Then I call it a dirty trick. Never mind. I'll bring you a lump of jelly home in my pocket." "You'll find Lottison is a very decent fellow," the Colonel told Biggles as they sat in the limousine. "The dinner was his suggestion, not mine. He's a busy man and couldn't manage any other time." There was one other guest, Admiral Sir Edmund Hardy, head of the Admiralty Intelligence Department. After the meal was over, Lord Lottison led the way into his library and, without any preamble, embarked on the problem that had brought them together. "Well, gentlemen, I don't think there's any need for me to repeat what we all know now, although only suspected, until Major Bigglesmith brought the matter of the misspelt SOS message to our notice. Our munition ships bound for the East are not foundering by accident. If proof of that were needed, the master of the Tasman, the ship which picked up the SOS sent out by the 4th vessel to be sunk, confirms that the word weather was spelt W-H-E-T-H-E-R. That, I think, settles any possibility of coincidence. The question is, what are we going to do about it? I need hardly say that any steps we take must be made with extreme delicacy. At all costs, we must avoid a situation that might end in war. Now, Hardy, what do you suggest?" The Admiral studied the ash on his cigar thoughtfully. "If you're prepared to back me up, I'm prepared to go ahead and comb every sea mile between Calcutta and Singapore." A worried frown creased Lord Lottison's forehead. "I'm not anxious to take the risk of precipitating the country into a first-class row. If things go wrong, I shall be the scapegoat." Biggles fidgeted impatiently. "May I be allowed to make a suggestion, sir?" "I should welcome one." "Very well, then. Let's get right down to brass tacks," proposed Biggles bluntly. "Our ships are being sunk. Cleverly, secretly. Clearly, we've got to hoist the enemy with his own petard and dispose of him in just the same way. Cleverly, secretly. Do you agree to that?" "Absolutely." "Good. Now, this private war is being carried on either by a surface vessel or an underwater craft operating from a base which is being fed by supplies from the country that owns it. As I see it, we can either sink the ship that is doing the dirty work, or we can wipe out the base. If you're going to be content with sinking the ship or submarine, all you have to do is send a ship out to Singapore and let it be known that she's carrying munitions. Then line her sides with concealed guns so that the raider can be given its quietus as soon as it shows up. But it isn't much good killing a wasp and leaving the nest. And, with all due respect to you, sir, Biggles glanced at the Admiral, the finding of that nest is a job for aircraft.
Then we shall have to call the Air Force in, declared Lord Lotterson.
They'd do the job all right, admitted Biggles, but the enemy would soon know what was afoot. You can't send out aeroplanes to look for something without telling the crews what to look for. And then it will only be a question of time before rumours reach the ears of the people we're up against.
And what the devil are we to do? Burst out Lord Lotterson irritably.
Well, sir, I've given the matter some thought, and this is my idea. It is a case where cooperation is necessary, but in such a way that the fewest people know what is actually in the wind. The chief properties required would be an ordinary merchant ship, a destroyer, and an aircraft. The purpose of the ship would be to act as a bait, a decoy. No one on board except the captain need know that, plus, of course, the wireless operator, who would keep in touch with the destroyer and the aircraft, in code, on a special wavelength. Our decoy ship would, to all intents and purposes, be engaged on an ordinary job of work. The destroyer would keep close enough to the decoy ship to be effective in emergency, yet far enough away not to be associated with it. The aeroplane will operate between the two, and be fitted with one of the new silencers now under experiment at Farnborough. The decoy ship, its warlike cargo having been remarked in the press, will put to sea, followed shortly afterwards by the destroyer. Coincidental with their approach to the Indian Ocean, a long-distance flight will be commenced by a civil pilot. It's extremely unlikely that anyone will connect the three events. The pilot, in accordance with the best traditions of long-distance flights, will be blown off his course by contrary winds and possibly lose his way. Thus, no great surprise would be felt if he were seen anywhere in the region of the Bay of Bengal. Naturally, we hope that the raider will attack the decoy ship, whereupon the wireless operator will report to the aircraft or the destroyer, or both, who will head in that direction. And sink the raider, concluded the Admiral enthusiastically. Biggles looked pained. Oh, dear, no. The skipper of the decoy, being prepared for trouble, should be able to avoid it and escape as quickly as possible. The aircraft will pick up the raider and note the direction it takes with a view to ascertaining the approximate position of its base. It's pretty certain to head for home after its attack has failed. Even if it's a submarine, the pilot will be able to see it as clearly underwater as if it were afloat. From 20,000 feet, a pilot can see over an immense area, you know.
And if everything works out according to plan, and the pilot discovers the enemy base, what then?
Inquired Lord Lotterson. A peculiar smile flitted across Biggles' face.
Well, the base will have to be obliterated, blotted out.
Otherwise there's no point in finding it, is there?
No, I suppose not. But it sounds a very hazardous business to me, murmured the Admiral doubtfully.
I don't think anyone has suggested that it isn't, sir, answered Biggles a trifle harshly. Either we're going to wipe out this base when we find it, or we might as well stay at home. To be on the safe side—
Go on,
prompted Lord Lotterson. Well, I was thinking, sir, we could ask an RAF unit to come and do it. If they made a clean job, there would be little risk of detection. It could be made to look like an accident. After all, military aircraft carry out bombing practice regularly, and pilots are not to know that a secret submarine base has been established at the very spot selected for the bombing. What could the enemy do without admitting their guilt?
By heaven, I believe you're right, cried Lord Lotterson. But tell me, who is to fly this aircraft you've talked so much about? Who could be entrusted with such a job?
There's only one man for the job, put in Colonel Raymond quietly, speaking for the first time.
Will you undertake it, Bigglesworth?
Biggles did not hesitate. Certainly, sir.
I can't very well refuse, even if I wanted to. But in order that there is no misunderstanding, I might as well say right away that I should demand certain facilities. Well, let's hear them. In the first place, I should stipulate that you gave me complete control of the whole expedition. It would be no earthly use my giving orders if they weren't obeyed. Do you mean that you expect to be put in command of a destroyer? The Admiral was incredulous. No, but the captain would have to act on my instructions. But it's unheard of. A civilian in command of a naval unit, protested the Admiral. Biggles smiled. You can easily get over that by giving me, temporarily, a commission in the Royal Navy, with rank superior to that of the skipper of the destroyer. The Admiral glared. I haven't finished yet, sir, went on Biggles, looking at Lord Lotterson. I also want a temporary commission in the Royal Air Force, with rank of Air Commodore. Seeing the amazed look on the three men's faces, Biggles went on. It isn't a matter of personal vanity, gentlemen. I'm only thinking of the success of the show. I may need the Royal Air Force assistance, and if I, as a civilian, gate-crashed into the Royal Air Force headquarters at Singapore and demanded a machine, or even petrol or stores, I should be thrown out on my elbow. Yet upon my request might hang the success or failure of the expedition. It might never be necessary for me to use my rank, but if I had it, instead of the delay which might prove fatal to the show, I should be able to walk into an RAF depot, produce my authority, and demand what I required. It might be a good plan to warn the officer in charge of the Singapore station that I'm about, and that I might call upon him to undertake some unusual bombing operations. Very well. If you think it's necessary, I'll see what can be done, replied Lord Lotterson slowly. Then, after a moment's thought, let us call it settled. Draw up a plan of campaign as quickly as you can, Bigglesworth, setting down everything you require, and I will see to it that things are put in hand immediately. Will you do that? Biggles walked towards the door. You shall have it within 24 hours, sir. Biggles, Algy and Ginger sat on a water-worn breakwater near the primitive harbour at Tavoy in Lower Burma and gazed pensively towards the Bay of Bengal. It was a beautiful morning, with that false dawn which is only seen in the tropics, bathing everything in a weird, unnatural light. 3 weeks had passed since the momentous decision in Lotterson House, and each day had been one of intense activity as plans for the expedition had been pushed forward. Unexpected difficulties had been encountered and overcome, but in the end the preparations were concluded, and a general meeting of those chiefly concerned was held in an inner sanctum of the Foreign Office. Algy and Ginger attended in order that they might hear the plan unfolded in its entirety. The others present, besides those who had taken part in the preliminary debate in Lotterson House, were Air Marshal Sir Duggan Wales, liaison officer with the Air Ministry; Commander Michael Sullivan, R.N., captain of HMS Seafret, the destroyer detailed to act as a floating supply ship; Lieutenant Rupert Lovell, his navigating officer; Captain Angus MacFarlane of the Bengal Star, an old tramp steamer which had been selected as the decoy ship; and Chief Petty Officer Turrell, R.N., who was to act as the wireless operator on it. Lotterson had outlined the general plan in front of a huge wall map, and concluded by introducing Air Commodore Bigglesworth as the officer in supreme command of operations. Biggles had abandoned his request for naval rank on the assurance that Commander Sullivan would accept orders from him in his capacity of an air officer. Biggles' speech was brief and to the point, and merely a request for the loyalty and unswerving obedience to orders only by which success could be assured. On the following day, the Bengal Star put to sea, bound for Singapore via Calcutta. Notices issued to the press stated that she was loaded with crated aeroplanes. Actually, there was nothing more romantic than good Welsh coal below her decks. The Seafret, being faster, had given her 2 days' start, and another week had elapsed before the airmen set off after them with a pre-arranged rendezvous at Calcutta. The aeroplane chosen was a Storm amphibian, aptly named Nemesis, fitted with 2 Rolls-Royce Kestrel engines with special silencers and extra tanks, giving an endurance range of nearly 3,000 miles. Highly efficient wireless equipment, a powerful service camera, a machine gun of mobile type, and automatic pistols completed their outfit. With the Seafret in attendance, anything else they required could always be obtained at short notice. So far, everything had gone in accordance with the scheme. The Bengal Star had proceeded on her way southeast from Calcutta, with the Seafret in constant radio communication, taking care to keep within reach should her presence be demanded. The Nemesis, in touch with both, officially on a long-distance flight to Australia, had followed in her own way, watching the Bengal Star from afar by day and lying at any convenient harbour during the night, refuelling when necessary from Seafret. Biggles glanced at his watch. "Well, come on," he said. "It's light enough to get away." He took the folded map and opened it out flat on the breakwater. According to dead reckoning, the Bengal Star should be about here. We mustn't let her get too far away from us. I hate letting her out of my sight. "Well, Turrell will always warn us if he sees anything suspicious," murmured Algy, as they moved towards the Nemesis. "That's true," admitted Biggles, "but I'm always scared that something will happen at night when it's too dark for us to see what's going on. Start her up, Ginger, and then get to the keyboard and tune in." Five minutes later, the Nemesis was in the air, with Biggles at the controls, heading southwest across the track of the decoy ship. "What the dickens is Ginger doing?" asked Biggles presently, with a glance at Algy, who was sitting beside him. "He's a long time picking up the Star. Take over. I'll go back and see what he's up to." He handed the stick to Algy and ducked through the low doorway that gave access to the cabin. Ginger was sitting at the radio, but when he saw Biggles, slipped off his headphones. "There's something wrong somewhere. I can't get a sound of any sort from out of the Bengal Star." "Have you spoken to the Seafret?" "Yes, they can't make contact either. Lee, the operator on the Seafret, says he last spoke to the Star at 5:30 and got a position. He arranged to speak to Turrell again at 6 o'clock. Lee remained on duty, and 5 minutes to 6 he got the call sign from the Star. It was repeated twice and came over very quickly as if something was urgent. There was an uproar of atmospherics or buzzing that nearly blew his eardrums out. It went on for more than a minute and then cut out dead. After that there was silence, and he hasn't been able to get a sound since." "I don't like it," muttered Biggles tensely. "Ask Lee for the Star's last known position and send a signal to Commander Sullivan telling him to proceed at full speed to the spot. Let me know that position as soon as you get it." Biggles hurried back to the cockpit. "Neither Ginger or Lee can get a sound out of the Bengal Star," he told Algy crisply. "Give her all the throttle, and from this height we ought to be able to see the Star in about 10 minutes. Ginger's face appeared in the doorway, and he handed Biggles the Star's last position. Biggles passed it to Algy, who, after a glance at his chart, altered his course a trifle. Nothing more was said. The minutes passed slowly. Biggles sat in the spare seat beside Algy, scanning the sea methodically, section by section, hoping to see the Star's masts appear above the horizon. Presently, he glanced at the watch on the instrument board. "She's gone," he said, in a curiously expressionless voice. "Begins to look like it," admitted Algy, with fatalistic calm. When another 5 minutes had elapsed, they knew the Bengal Star had disappeared. "Let me have her for a bit," said Biggles, and changing places with Algy, he began turning in wide circles. Suddenly, Algy caught Biggles' left arm. "What's that?" Biggles, tilting the Nemesis over so that he could look down, followed Algy's outstretched finger. "Wreckage, I fancy. he said quietly, at the same time beginning to side-slip steeply towards it. I can see oil stains too, observed Algy. Then, is that a man? Look. Yes, by gosh, there's somebody there. I saw an arm wave. Down you go. All right, don't get excited. I'm going down as fast as I can, replied Biggles. Call Ginger to stand by to help you to get him aboard. The keel of the Nemesis kissed the water, and a long, creamy wake curved like a bow as the Nemesis swung round to come alongside the flimsy piece of timber to which the sole survivor was clinging. Look out! He's sinking! Cried Algy suddenly. The sentence was cut short by his splash as he struck the water in a clumsy dive. The man had already disappeared beneath the water when he struck it. For a few seconds, Algy, too, disappeared from sight. Then he reappeared with the unconscious sailor in his arms. Quick! He spluttered. Ginger was already lying flat out on the wing, hand outstretched over the trailing edge. Still clinging to his unconscious burden, Algy seized it, and Ginger began to drag him towards the hull. At that moment, another movement caught Biggles' eye, and he drew his breath sharply. Cutting through the water, towards the commotion, was the black, triangular-shaped dorsal fin of a shark, the dreaded grey nurse of the deep seas. In a flash, he was out on the wing, drawing his automatic as he went. The killer swerved sharply and dived, showing its white belly as it flashed under the boat. Thrusting the pistol back into his pocket, Biggles dropped onto his knees and, reaching down, caught the sailor under the armpits. You help Algy, Ginger, he cried, and dragged the unconscious man aboard. The weight on the wing caused it to dip sharply, which made matters easier for Algy, who with much spluttering and grunting pulled himself up, panting for breath and retching violently from the seawater he had swallowed. Biggles dropped on all fours and began dragging the unconscious man towards the hull. Come on, Algy! Come on, Ginger! He cried desperately. Get aboard, or... He broke off, staring at a broad crimson stain that meandered along the wing. Great heaven! Where's all this blood coming from? He cried in a horror-stricken voice. Then he saw and shuddered. The unfortunate sailor's right foot had been bitten off, clean above the ankle. Biggles' manner became peremptory. Ginger, go into the cabin, make it snappy. Get out the medicine box and a piece of cord. We shall have to get a tourniquet around that leg pretty sharp or he'll bleed to death. Half lifting him, half dragging him, he got the injured man into the cabin, where, on the floor, he applied rough but efficient first aid. Algy, get into the cockpit, take off, make for the sea fret as fast as you can, and land as near to her as you dare. Within a short time, they landed by the sea fret, and Biggles stood on the ship's deck while the wounded man was lifted by many willing hands into the sick bay. Commander Sullivan looked at Biggles' strained face and dishevelled clothing with anxious eyes. Where did you pick that fellow up? He asked. He's one of the crew of the Bengal Star, replied Biggles quietly. In fact, he's the only survivor. The naval officer blanched. Good heavens! You mean... The Star's gone. Sunk. A few sticks, and this poor fellow are all that remain. We saw him in the water, but a shark took his foot off before we could get him. Your doctor's got to save his life so that he can tell us what happened. You might get your fellow to make my aircraft fast and keep an eye on her while the rest of my crew come aboard. Biggles looked pale. It's my fault. I should have foreseen it. That's nonsense, put in Sullivan. Ah, here's the doctor. The doctor's face was pale as he hurried up to them. If you want to speak to him, you'd better come right away. He hasn't long, I'm afraid. At the last words, Biggles grew white to the lips. Hasn't long? Why, his foot... The foot's nothing. I could patch that up. But he's got a bullet through the stomach, and with the water he swallowed, that's more than I or anyone else can cope with. Come on. The wounded man's eyes were on them as they walked into the sick room. "What's your name, laddie?"
"Edgrove, sir."
"Can you tell us what happened this morning? Don't hurry. Just tell us quietly, in your own words."
"I'll tell you as much as I know, sir,"
answered the dying man in a weak voice.
"I was on lookout. It was just before 6, I should think. It was still dark. About a mile to starboard I could see phosphorescence on the water, like as if it was a shark's fin or something. Then I see a thing like a pole sticking out, and I knew what it was. Then there was a terrific explosion amidships, and I hit me at a crack on the deck. As I lay there, I seemed to remember hearing another explosion. I see something else too. Funny it was. The wireless aerial was a mass of sparks, blue sparks, like lightning darting up and down. Our engines had stopped, and I could hear the skipper blinding the submarine to all eternity and shouting orders."
The wounded man paused for breath, and the doctor moistened his lips with a sponge. "What happened after that?" asked Biggles.
"Oh, Star, she gave us a quick lurch and started going down, so I jumped overboard and started swimming as hard as I could. I got about 50 or 60 yards when I saw the sub pop up not far away and people come out on the deck. When I turned my head, the Star had gone, but there were 2 boats on the water. One picks me up, and at that minute the sub opened fire on us with a machine gun, and before you could say Jack Robinson, the boat had sunk under us. A bullet hit me in the stomach somewhere, but I caught hold of an oar and hung on to it, and saw them deal with a second boat in the same way. Then they cruised round and round, shooting at everyone they saw in the water. Every time they came near me, I sunk under the oar and held my breath till I thought my lungs had burst. Then the sub made off, and when it got light, I could see that I was the only one left. I see the aeroplane coming and waved my hand, and then I felt the shark pull me under the foot. That's all I remember. Can I have a drink, Doctor?"
The doctor looked at Biggles. "Any more questions?" "Just one," answered Biggles. "Tell me, Ladgrove, did you happen to note the course taken by the submarine when it went off?"
"Yes, sir. It was due southeast."
"Thanks," nodded Biggles. Making his way back to the deck, he stared with unseeing eyes at the blue water. Ginger watched him for a moment and then nudged Algy.
"Don't tell me the skipper's crying,"
he whispered. Algy glanced up. "Shouldn't be surprised. I saw him do that once before in France." The doctor joined them on the deck. "I suppose there's no hope for him?" asked Biggles quietly. "He's dead," answered the doctor shortly. Half an hour later, after a hasty breakfast, they foregathered in the captain's cabin to discuss a revised plan of campaign, made necessary by the loss of the decoy ship. It was not a cheerful gathering, for the fate of the crew of the Bengal Star weighed heavily upon them. Biggles frowned. "A thing like this, involving loss of life, can't be kept secret. Naturally, the public will not be told the truth, for that would warn the enemy that his scheme is discovered. We shall have to leave that to the discretion of the Foreign Office. But the Bengal Star has not been lost in vain. For the first time, a survivor has been able to tell us the course taken, and we know that instead of sending out a false SOS from the ships they sink, they're jamming the radio equipment. At least we now have a rough idea where to look for her, so the sooner we start the better. I shall run down to Singapore and tell the RAF people what we're about and warn them we may need their help." Sullivan suddenly sprang to his feet. "By the way, I picked up a letter for you at Akyab on the way down." He opened a drawer and passed the letter to Biggles, who raised his eyebrows wonderingly. Tearing it open, he glanced swiftly at the signature at the end. "It's from Tom Lowry, an old friend of mine. He's a squadron leader in the RAF, stationed at Singapore. Pardon me, I'll see what he has to say." "My dear Biggles, this may reach you, or it may not. But having seen about your flight to Australia in the papers, I thought it was worth trying. I shall be flying over the same ground as you on the way to Singapore. I'm flying back the first of the new Gannet flying boats with which my squadron is to be equipped, and I thought there was a chance that we might meet somewhere, so keep an eye open for me. By the way, that conversation of ours at Simpson's, there's probably nothing in it, but a storekeeper in Singapore told me a funny yarn not so long ago about something fishy going on in the Magui archipelago. Something about certain people who don't like us having a wireless station there. I've been wondering if there was a connection between that and the message Ramsay picked up. Anyway, I mention it because instead of flying straight down the coast, I shall probably fly down the archipelago, keeping an eye open for anything that's about. We may meet at Singapore. Cheerios and all the best. Tom." Mused Biggles. "Judging by the date on the letter, he'll be in Singapore by now, so no doubt I shall see him there. Now to more important things. I shall fly down to Singapore today and come back tomorrow. While I'm away, I want you to find a quiet creek where you can hide up, on the coast opposite the Magui Islands, because if the submarine stuck to the course it was on when Ladgrove last saw it, it would make a landfall somewhere in the archipelago. So that's where I'm going to start looking for it. You may find it a bit dull just sitting in a creek with nothing else to do but keep me going with food and fuel, but I can't help that. Keep out of sight as far as you can. Any comments?" Sullivan shook his head. "No, except I've been here before, and I think I know a place where I can lie up with small chance of being seen." He got up and indicated a spot on the chart that lay at his table. "Here it is. If you don't get a signal from me, this is where you'll find me." "Fine," exclaimed Biggles, rising. "All right then, we'll get along to Singapore and rejoin you tomorrow evening." The sun was sinking like a blood-red ball when the Nemesis landed at Singapore, and Biggles, wearing his new uniform for the first time, made his way to station headquarters, where he found the group captain in command working in his office. Biggles lost no time in explaining the situation. "My name is Bigglesworth," he began. "Yes, I had a secret minute from the ministry about you," replied the other quickly. "Good. Then that makes things easier for me. No doubt you'll wonder what's going on, so I'm going to tell you. I shouldn't, but it's better that you should know because it may help you act with confidence and without hesitation if you get a message from me asking you to perform a duty so unusual that you might well be excused for hesitating or even refusing to carry it out. Is that all clear so far?" "Perfectly, sir," replied the group captain, looking at Biggles with an odd expression. Biggles then rapidly and concisely explained the situation. At the conclusion he asked, "You served in the war, did you?" The group captain nodded. "Good," said Biggles. "You'll remember the old zone call that we used to use to turn every gun in the line onto a certain target. If you get a zone call beginning with the unusual ZZ and followed by a pinpoint map reference, you'll act on it immediately. To make quite sure there's no mistake, the message will conclude with a password which will be Nomad. On receipt of such a signal, you will put every aircraft you can into the air with a full load of bombs or torpedoes and blot the submarine base off the face of the earth. Have you any idea where it's likely to be?" "I'm not sure, but I think it'll be one of the islands in the Magui archipelago. Have I made myself perfectly clear?" "Quite, sir." "Then that's that. I shall spend the night here and go back to Magui in the morning. Is Tom Lowry about? I'd like a word with him." The group captain raised his eyebrows. "You haven't heard, evidently." "Heard what?" "Lowry is missing."
Biggles stared.
"Missing?" "Well, he's 4 days overdue. No one's seen or heard a word of him since he left Rangoon. We've made a search for him, but I'm afraid he's down. If he's down in the jungle, there's just a chance that he may turn up. But there seems to be no earthly reason why he should fly overland in a flying boat. No, I'm afraid he's down in the sea."
Biggles looked out of the window, thinking swiftly.
"I wonder," he breathed.
5 days later, from 20,000 feet, Biggles and his companions gazed down on the sun-soaked waters of the Bay of Bengal. Below, the islands of the Magui archipelago lay like a necklace of emeralds dropped carelessly on a turquoise road. It was the 4th day of their search over the long string of islands. Each day, for 8 hours, they had remained in the air, but without result, and they were all beginning to feel the strain. They'd seen nothing of note except a junk moving slowly northward, leaving a feather of wake behind her to reveal that she had an auxiliary engine. Proceeding on their way south, Ginger was flying, with Biggles and Algy left to play the part of observers. Algy was using binoculars and gazed down at an irregular, tree-clad area of land which, from their altitude, looked no larger than a fair-sized wood. Suddenly, he shifted his position. "Biggles," he said sharply, "can you see something? A speck of white, almost in the middle of the island." Algy passed the glasses. Biggles looked at the object for a long time with intense concentration. "It's the broken wing of an aeroplane. We'd better have a closer look at this. Put her down, Ginger." Biggles studied the island inch by inch through the glasses as the machine glided down towards it. There was no sign of life anywhere. At a little more than 1,000 feet, a crashed aeroplane was seen lying in the jungle, about halfway between the eastern side of the island and an elevation in the middle, and the mutilated treetops showed how tremendous had been the impact. Soon, the Nemesis was taxiing up onto the clean silver beach. With firm sand under their feet, they looked about them expectantly, but a significant silence hung over everything, and Biggles shrugged his shoulders meaningfully. "I think you'd better stay here, Ginger," he said quietly. "Keep guard over the machine and fire 3 quick shots if you need help. Come on, Algy." Without another word, he set off in the direction of the crash. Before they'd gone very far, they found it necessary to draw the knives they carried in their belts, so thick was the undergrowth. Finally, at the edge of the clearing made by the falling plane, they stopped, fearful of what they knew they would find. Then they advanced towards the wreckage of a boat-shaped hull with the red, white and blue ring markings of the Royal Air Force painted on it. The pilot was still in his seat, helmet askew, goggles smashed and hanging down. Biggles took one swift look at the face and then turned away, white and trembling. "It's Tom," he said. A second body, in air mechanics overalls, lay a short distance away where it had been hurled clear, and Biggles pushed his way towards it. A sharp cry brought Algy to his side, and he pointed an accusing finger at the dead man's forehead, where a little blue hole told its own grim story. "That's a gunshot wound," he said harshly. "Tom was shot down. That is something I did not suspect. By heaven, if I ever get my hands on these swine, they'll know about it. They're using aircraft besides submarines, evidently." Poor old Tom. "We'd better fetch the Seafred here and ask Sullivan to send a burying party ashore. Frankly, it's a task beyond me. You go down and join Ginger. Take off, and as soon as you're in the air, send a signal to Sullivan, asking him to come right away. I'll stay and collect the things out of their pockets for evidence of identification, and then join you again on the beach as soon as you've got the signal off. How does that sound to you?" Algy nodded. "Yes, I think that's the best plan. See you on the beach presently, but don't be long. I've got a nasty feeling about this place."
I'm not feeling too happy about it myself, said Biggles, as he set about his gruesome task. Some time later, after he had recovered all the things from the dead men's pockets, he heard the engines of the Nemesis start up, and then another sound that caused him to stare upwards in alarm. Above the subdued hum of the Nemesis engines came the sound of another plane, and the scream of wind-torn wings and wires that told a story of terrific speed. He saw the Nemesis climbing seaward on a steady course, clearly unaware of its danger. Behind it, dropping out of the eye of the sun like a winged bullet, a small single-seat seaplane, painted red. Breathless, he stood quite still. There was nothing he could do. In a sort of numb stupor, he watched the pilot of the seaplane half pull out of his dive, swing round on the tail of the Nemesis, align his sights on the target, and open fire. Biggles felt cold perspiration break out on his face as the Nemesis swerved sickeningly. But when he saw the machine swing round in a tight Immelman turn, he knew that whoever was at the controls had not been hit, for the maneuver was one that could only be performed by a machine under perfect control. Again, the seaplane fired, and again the Nemesis twisted like a snipe to spoil the other's aim. Then the Nemesis, both engines stopped and with propellers stationary, began to zigzag back towards the land, at the same time side-slipping first to left and then to right in order to lose height. The seaplane was round after it in a flash, little tongues of orange flame flickering from the concealed guns in its engine cowling, and with the seaplane in close attendance, the Nemesis disappeared from sight behind the high ridge of trees on Biggles' right. He clenched his teeth as the harsh, staccato chatter of a machine gun palpitated through the still air. And then there followed a screaming wail that was cut short by a crash like that made by a giant tree when it falls in a forest. The echoes died away. The parrots that had circled high in the air in alarm at the unusual spectacle returned to their perches, and once more the languorous silence of the tropics settled over the scene. Biggles, throwing the things he had collected into a heap, set off at a wild run in the direction of the hill behind which the machines had disappeared. Ginger, looking back at the seaplane, saw that its nose was dipping down, 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 until it was nearly vertical. Unconsciously, he winced as it struck the trees and seemed to dissolve in a cloud of flying splinters. The terrible noise of the crash came floating up to him. Algy was not taking the slightest notice of him or the crash. He was levelling out over a stretch of black, oily water, surrounded on all sides by trees with which he felt sure that he would presently collide. For a few seconds, it was touch and go, and then, in some curious way, the Nemesis was floating motionless on its own inverted image, while little ripples ruffled the water and disappeared under the dark trees that lined the water's edge. "Good shooting, kid," said Algy, looking up at Ginger and smiling in a peculiar, strained sort of manner. "Did you get the message off?" No. I only got the call sign and our position out when a bullet knocked the instrument to smithereens." Algy grimaced. "Why did you come down?" asked Ginger. Algy, taking stock of their surroundings, told him shortly, for two very good reasons. A bullet must have hit something vital. Both engines cut out together. So I made for the only stretch of water within reach that was big enough to land on. It looks to me as if we're on the edge of that big mangrove swamp at the end of the island, and there isn't a way out to the sea. I noticed that from the air before I put her down." "How are we going to get out?" "I don't think we ever shall, unless we can fix things up and fly her out. Poor old Biggles will be in a stew.
He must have seen the whole thing. I wonder if we can make him hear us. Let's try a hail. Cupping his hands round his mouth, Algy yelled 2 or 3 times. But the only answer was the screech of startled parrots and parakeets that rose into the air from the surrounding trees, voicing their indignation at the intrusion. "Nothing doing," said Ginger, regarding the watery glade with apprehension. On all sides, the sombre mangroves lifted their gnarled trunks on fantastic, stilt-like roots from the black waters and slime of the swamp, from which sprang growths of exotic flowers, the only spots of colour in a world of desolation and decay. The air, heavy with the stench of corruption, was still, and endowed the place with an atmosphere of sinister foreboding. Ginger shivered. It did not take them very long to locate the damage to the Nemesis. The gravity tank had been holed, and the petrol lead from the main tank had been severed by bullets. But as far as they could ascertain, nothing else was severely damaged except the wireless gear, which was completely wrecked. "Can you put it right?" asked Algy, looking at Ginger, who was examining the fractures with professional eye. "Yes, but it'll take some time to make an airworthy job of it," said Ginger, glancing at the sun, now sinking fast behind the treetops. "I shan't get it finished in time to get out of here tonight." Algy looked grave. "I don't mind that. It's Biggles not knowing what has happened to us that upsets me. I wonder if it's possible to get out of this swamp on foot. By clambering over the roots of these foul-looking trees, one might be able to make terra firma. I tell you what, you get on and try and repair the damage to her, and I'll try and work my way round to solid ground and look for Biggles. With luck, I might be able to bring him back here. Or we could fetch you and spend the night on the beach." "I think that's a good scheme," agreed Ginger. "I think we ought to make a big effort to let Biggles know how things stand. But be careful what you're doing in that swamp. It wouldn't be a healthy place to get stuck in." "I think I can manage it," replied Algy, crawling along the wing and letting himself down carefully on the twisted roots of the nearest tree, regardless of the clamour set up by a number of monkeys. "Got your gun?" asked Ginger, watching him rather doubtfully. Algy tapped his pocket and nodded. Ginger turned to go on with his work, glancing occasionally into the swamp where Algy was slowly picking his way over the roots. But after he had disappeared from sight, he became engrossed in his task and concentrated on it until he became conscious that darkness was falling. Looking up with a start, he saw a thin miasma of mist was rising slowly from the silent water about him, and somehow the scenery seemed to have changed. He drew in his breath quickly with a little gasp of consternation. There was no longer any land visible, nor any of the tentacle-like roots, and the branches of the nearest tree, instead of being several feet above the wing as they had been, were actually brushing it. Then, with a flash of understanding, he perceived what had happened. The tide had come in, raising the level of the water several feet. "Algy!" he cried loudly in a sudden panic as he realized what the result might be if Algy had not succeeded in reaching the far side of the swamp. "Algy!" His voice echoed eerily away among the trees. There was no reply. Algy had not covered a third of the distance that separated him from dry land when he became aware of the flowing tide. The turgid water was flowing steadily past him, gurgling and sucking amongst the hollows in the roots. He slowly realized that he could get no further in the direction in which he was heading, and that his retreat was completely cut off. He experienced a pang of real fear, for he needed no one to tell him that a mangrove swamp is no place in which to be benighted. For a while he scrambled desperately from branch to branch, after the manner of the renowned Tarzan of the Apes, taking advantage of any handhold that offered itself. But now, sitting astride a fork to contemplate his predicament, he was completely reluctant to admit to himself that he had completely lost all sense of direction. On all sides stretched the morass. Above, a gloomy tangle of interlaced branches. Below, the sullen water, as black as ink, except where grey, spectral raids of mist were beginning to form and creep silently over the surface. The only sounds were the soft, sinister gurgle of the questing, rising water, and the ever-increasing hum of countless myriads of mosquitoes. Algy realized that far from finding a way out of the swamp, he could not even leave the tree in which he was precariously perched. Swimming was out of the question, and as if in confirmation of this, a huge water snake, its head held erect like a periscope and its forked tongue flicking, went sailing past. He watched it out of sight, shuddering. By this time, it was practically dark, and abandoning all hope of getting clear until the tide went down, he was making himself as secure as possible on his perch when his hands, which were gripping the branch, felt suddenly as if hundreds of tiny pins were being stuck into them. Striking a match as quickly as his trembling fingers would permit, he saw that they were covered with thousands of the minute, dreaded Semot apis, the fire ants of the Malay Peninsula. His lips went dry when, in the yellow glow of the match, he saw that the branch on which he sat was swarming with them. Driven to desperation by the irritation, he instinctively started backing along the branch away from the trunk, which seemed to be the headquarters of the fiery army. An ominous creak warned him that he was testing it to the limit of its endurance, and he let out a yell of fear as with a loud crack, the branch broke off short. With a mighty splash, he, the branch, and the ants disappeared under the water. Blowing and gasping, and with his toes curling with horror, he struck out madly for the nearest tree, and clutching the rough bowl in his arms, he went up it in a manner that would have been impossible in cold blood. Grabbing at a bough, he pulled himself onto it, and throwing a leg over where it joined the trunk, he sagged limply, panting for breath, watching, as in a nightmare, the water dripping from him into the black stream below. As he gazed downwards, he became aware of a broad, V-shaped ripple surging towards him, and an instinctive fear made him jerk both of his legs clear of the water. He was only just in time. A black object broke the surface. There was a rush, a swirl, and a crash like slamming of iron gates as the crocodile's jaws came together. A cry of stark terror broke from Algy's lips. He looked down and saw a vague black shadow slowly approaching again, and a bitter hatred took possession of him. Feeling in his soaking pocket, he took out his automatic and, taking careful aim, pulled the trigger. With a convulsive swirl, the crocodile half threw itself out of the water, plunged back, and then disappeared from sight. "Here, be careful what you're doing with that gun," called a voice near at hand. In his astonishment, Algy nearly fell in the water again. "Biggles!" he cried joyfully. "Where the dickens are you?" came Biggles' voice. "Here, up a tree," answered Algy. "Where on earth are you? In a boat?" "I'm not swimming, you can bet your life on that," returned Biggles tersely. "What in the name of goodness are you doing up there? And where's Ginger?" Algy lowered himself down into the boat. Well, the last time I saw him, he was in the machine, nailing up holes in the petrol tank. "What machine?" "Our machine, of course." Biggles stared. "But I thought I heard it crash. I've been looking for the wreck ever since." "Oh, it was the other fellow who crashed, not us. Ginger plastered him with a whole drum of ammo." "Where did he crash?" "Somewhere over the other side of this foul swamp. There's a sort of lake in the middle of it, and I managed to get the Nemesis down onto it. By the way, where the dickens did you get this conveyance?" "It's the collapsible rubber canoe out of poor Tom's crash," replied Biggles. "It isn't too safe, but it's better than nothing. Is the machine badly damaged?" "No. I had to get down as best I could and where I could. Then, knowing you'd be worried, I set off to look for you while Ginger did the repairs. But I got marooned in the tree. Where were you bound for when you came along this way?" "I was looking for you," answered Biggles, "although I don't mind admitting that I've been going round in circles when I heard you singing." "Singing? My foot!" interrupted Algy indignantly. "I was yelling with fright." "Well, it was easy enough to make the mistake," protested Biggles, grinning. "In which direction is this lake of yours?" "I haven't the remotest idea." "Then we'd better set about looking for it." A revolver shot had split the silence. "That sounds like Ginger. He must have heard your shots, and he's trying to let you know where he is.
Sounds as if it came from this direction. Fire another shot and keep your eyes open for an answering flash. We ought to be able to see it in this darkness.
Algy pointed the muzzle of his automatic skywards and pulled the trigger, only to cower down as a pandemonium of shrieks and barks instantly broke out over his head. "What in the name of thunder is that?" he gasped.
Sounds as if your pals, the monkeys, thought you were shooting at them, murmured Biggles,
moving the boat forward as a flash showed momentarily through the trees some distance away, to be followed by another report. After that, it was only a question of time before they reached the open stretch of water on which the Nemesis rested. Ginger let out a hail when he saw them.
"You've been a long time," he observed, looking at Algy reproachfully as they drew alongside. Algy glared at him meaningfully as he climbed aboard. "Never mind that. We're here now, and that's all that matters," murmured Biggles, philosophically. "Open up some of the emergency rations, Ginger, and let's have a bite of food. After that, I think a spot of shut-eye is indicated. We shall have to be on the move as soon as it's daylight. If that fellow you shot down has any friends about, they'll be looking for him bright and early."
Shortly after dawn the following morning, Ginger was putting the finishing touches to the fractured petrol lead.
"Whereabouts did the seaplane hit the ground, Ginger?" asked Biggles.
Ginger pointed to an adjacent tree-covered slope beyond the irregular outline of the mangroves.
"Somewhere over there," he said.
"Why? Are you thinking of going to it?"
"I don't know yet," replied Biggles thoughtfully. "The first thing I want to do is to get out of this place and find the sea fret. Sullivan will wonder what the deuce has happened to us, but what I should like to know is whether the fellow in the seaplane spotted us flying around from his base on the ground and came out to get us, or whether he was merely cruising about and lighted on us by accident."
"He may have been searching for Tom's crash," suggested Ginger.
"That's possible," agreed Biggles.
"Or Tom might have been close to their base, so they shot him down. I suppose there's no doubt about the fellow in the seaplane being killed, Algy."
"None whatever," declared Algy emphatically, anointing his ant-bites with boracic from the medicine chest.
"That kite went to pieces like a sheet of wet tissue paper in a gale."
"I see," replied Biggles. "All right. If you fellows are through, we'll see about getting away. Have you finished, Ginger?" "Yes, I think she's okay now," answered Ginger, stepping down into the cockpit and turning on the petrol. Decks were quickly cleared, and everything made shipshape for departure. Biggles took his place at the joystick, with Algy beside him, while Ginger watched proceedings from the cabin door. Biggles twirled the self-starter and smiled his relief as both engines came to life at the first attempt. With a muffled roar, the amphibian sped across the placid water, soared up in the air, and with very little room to spare, cleared the trees and swung round towards the open sea. The first thing they saw was the sea fret, cruising along near the shore at half speed, apparently looking for them. Biggles throttled back and glided down into a little bay where, within minutes, the sea fret joined them. The destroyer lowered a boat, and the three airmen, after making the amphibian fast to the destroyer, joined Sullivan on the quarterdeck. Sullivan looked at them curiously. "What's been going on?" he asked. "We got the call signal and your position, but that was all. So we concluded you were down somewhere, either in the sea or on one of the islands." "We were," Biggles told him. "Listen, and I'll tell you what happened. Although we've no time to spare, I have a feeling that we're by no means safe here. We're close to the enemy stronghold, or my calculations are all at sea." Briefly, he described how they had found the flying boat and its dead crew, and how, while calling up the destroyer for assistance, they had themselves been shot down. "It looks as if we're getting warm," muttered Sullivan when he had finished. "What's your program now?" "First of all, I want you to send a party ashore to bury poor Tom Lowry and his gunner and collect their personal effects. While that's going on, I want a couple of strong fellows with cutlass or billhooks to help me find the red seaplane. we may discover something important on it. As soon as we've done that, you'd better push off to the mainland out of harm's way while we get on with the job of finding the base. It's going to be a bit awkward without wireless, but we shall have to manage for the time being."
Biggles turned to Ginger.
"While I'm ashore, if Algier will go with the party to Tom's crash, I shall leave you in charge of the machine. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir," replied Ginger smartly. A day of activity followed. It began with the destroyer's boat taking 2 parties ashore. The first consisted of Algier with a dozen sailors, who had been allotted the dismal task of burying the 2 dead British airmen and collecting their effects. The second was smaller, being composed only of Biggles and 2 sailors who were to help him to cut a way through the dense jungle to the hillside on which the enemy seaplane had fallen. Ginger spent rather a lonely day, going over the Nemesis very carefully, and just as he finished refuelling from the Seafret store, a hail made him look up, and he saw Lovell, the navigating officer, looking over the rail.
"It looks as if we might be in for some bad weather," called the naval officer. "The barometer's falling."
Ginger thought sharply. "I think I'd better run the Nemesis up on the beach," he answered. "If I stay here and a sea gets up, she may smash her wingtips against your side. I'll get her ashore."
"Hadn't you better take a man with you in case you need help?" suggested Lovell.
"Thanks," agreed Ginger. "If the wind freshens, I may have to peg her down."
"All right. Stand by. I'll send you a hand."
A few moments later, one of the sailors, named Gilmore, ran down the steps and joined Ginger in the cockpit. Within a short time, the amphibian's nose turned into the slight breeze. "You can get out and have a stroll on dry ground for a change, if you like." "Thank you, sir," replied Gilmore, and jumped to the ground and disappeared under the wing. A few minutes later, Algy and his party, looking tired and depressed, emerged from the bushes, and while they were waiting for a boat to take them to the destroyer, Ginger told them why the Nemesis was on the beach. Then, as the destroyer's boat grated on the sand, Algy said, "You'd better wait here until Biggles comes back. He can't be very much longer." "Right-o. See you presently then," nodded Ginger, returning to the cabin as Algy departed. For what seemed to be a long time, he sat in the machine with his feet up on the opposite seat. Then, realizing it was getting late, he yawned and looked casually through the window at the jungle. As he gazed, a curious expression, in which incredulity and alarm were represented, stole over his face. Between 2 clumps of fern palm, on the very edge of the jungle and in deep shadow, an evil-looking face, surmounted by a tightly fitting skull-cap, peered out. It was perfectly still. The eyes did not even blink, but remained fixed steadfastly on the aircraft. Ginger rubbed his eyes and looked again. The face was no longer there, and he could see no sign of life. He noticed that the wind had dropped, and he remembered Gilmore. Swiftly, he made his way through to the cockpit and peered over the edge. The first thing he saw was Gilmore, lying on the soft sand under the wing, ominously still, his back arched in an unnatural manner. Ginger felt a sudden, unaccountable twinge of fear. "Gilmore," he whispered. "Gilmore," he said more loudly. The sailor did not move. Ginger moistened his lips and lifted his eyes again to the edge of the jungle. For a fleeting instant he caught sight of a face and heard a soft "poof," as if a light blow had fallen on the fuselage just below him. Turning, he was just in time to see a vague shadow flit across a narrow clearing. Drawing his automatic, he took aim at the bush behind which the shadow had disappeared and blazed at it recklessly, emptying his weapon of every single round. As the echoes of the shooting died away, everything seemed to come to life at once. Scores of birds rose into the air with shrill cries of alarm. There was a chorus of shouts and sudden orders from the direction of the destroyer, while at the same time there was a loud crashing in the bushes not far from the beach. Ginger saw with relief that a boat had been lowered from the ship and was already racing towards the Nemesis. But before it reached the shore, Biggles, gun in hand, followed by his 2 men, had burst through the bushes, looking swiftly for the cause of the uproar. He started when he saw Nemesis high and dry on the beach, and broke into a run towards it. A trembling Ginger jumped out and pointed at the jungle. "Be careful!" he shouted almost hysterically. "Watch out! They're in there!" "Who's in there?" "Someone, something, I don't know," answered Ginger incoherently. The destroyer's boat reached the beach, and Algy and several sailors, armed with rifles, leapt ashore and raced up to where the others were standing. "What's going on?" asked Algy quickly. "I'm dashed if I know," replied Biggles. "Come on, Ginger, pull yourself together. What did you see?" Before Ginger could answer, a cry of horror broke from the lips of one of the sailors. He was staring, ashen-faced, at Gilmore, still lying in the dark shadow under the wing. Ginger took one look at the bared teeth and staring eyes, and then covered his face with his hands. Biggles shook him roughly. "How did it happen?" he snapped. But a chief petty officer, who had seen much service in the Far East, had taken in the situation at a glance. "Cover those bushes!" he cried tersely to the sailors who were armed, "and shoot at anything that you see move." He turned to Biggles. "Gilmore was killed by a blowpipe. Look at this." He held up a tiny pointed dart, discoloured at the tip. "One scratch of that, and you're a goner inside 10 minutes. I've seen him before." "Where did you find that?" asked Biggles quickly. "Stuck in the nose of your aeroplane. They would have had you, sir, if they'd known you were in the jungle," the chief petty officer told Biggles seriously. "They've cleared off now, by the looks of it, but they won't have gone far away. We don't want to be caught here in the dark, so I suggest everyone returns to the boat. I take the aeroplane out too, sir, or you won't find much of it left in the morning." "What made you bring her ashore?" Biggles asked Ginger as they started the engines. "I was told that the glass was falling, so I thought she'd be safer ashore than on the water." "Yes, you were right there," admitted Biggles, as he eased the throttle forward and ran the Nemesis down into the sea. "It's a bad business about that sailor being killed. I don't know what's going wrong on this trip. We've had nothing but casualties since the time we started." Sullivan awaited them on the sea fret with a gloomy face. "Let's go below," suggested Biggles curtly. They made their way to the commander's cabin, where the 3 airmen sank wearily into such seats as they could find. Although the porthole was wide open, the atmosphere was heavy and oppressive. "I'm beginning to wonder if we haven't taken on something rather beyond our limited resources," said the commander grimly. "I'm beginning to wonder the same thing," confessed Biggles slowly, staring morosely through the open porthole into the growing darkness. "It's these casualties that depress me." He broke off and began walking slowly up and down the cabin. All the same, I don't think we can stop now, whatever the cost may be. But where have these people come from suddenly? They weren't here yesterday, because if they had been, they would certainly have seen us land, and it would have been the easiest thing in the world to have bumped us off. Moreover, they would have been to Tom Lowry's crash, if only to look for plunder. Yet nothing had been touched. Sullivan, have you seen any local craft about? Only a junk this morning, well out to sea. Was it under steam or sail? Both, I fancy, judging by the speed she was moving. Was the mainsail red and the jib yellow by any chance? Sullivan raised his eyebrows. Why, yes, that's right. Biggles, coming to a standstill, faced the commander squarely. I saw that same craft yesterday morning. It was a long way north of here. What course was this junk on when you saw her? Northwesterly. That means that you would have lost sight of her as she passed beyond the next island. What's the name of it? Latimer Island. What are you trying to get at? Biggles looked thoughtful. If the junk beat back to the far side of the island, after disappearing behind Latimer Island, it could have landed these toughs. Then you think the junk's still hanging out? I shouldn't be surprised. Algy noticed that Biggles was staring at Sullivan with a most extraordinary expression on his face, as if he was suddenly disinterested in the conversation. Then he appeared to recover himself. To tell you the truth, he exclaimed in a firm voice, I think that Gilmore died from a snake bite. Ginger stared at Biggles incredulously, wondering what had suddenly come over him. Without looking at them, he had walked the full length of the cabin, turned at right angles, and was now walking back as close to the wall as possible. Near to the porthole, he stopped, facing them. What I hope most of all, he continued, is that my staff have not lost their capacity for prompt action. There was a curious inflection in his voice. Sullivan frowned. What on earth are you talking about? I'll show you, answered Biggles, and whirling round, he thrust his right arm far through the porthole. The other saw him take a quick pace backwards, bracing himself as if to support a weight, at the same time jerking his arm inwards. They all sprang to their feet as a face, wearing an expression of astonished alarm, appeared in the circular brass frame of the porthole. Biggles' fingers were twisted in the long, greasy hair. Outside, Sullivan, he snapped. You'll have to get him from outside. Jump to it. Algy, get your hands round his neck. I daren't let go of his hair. Sullivan darted through the doorway. There was a rush of feet on deck. The man, now snarling with rage, had his head through the porthole and his shoulders jammed tightly against the frame, the rest of his body being outside. There came the splash of a boat on water, and muffled words outside. All right, sir, let go. We've got him. Biggles and Algy released their grip. The face disappeared, and a moment later Sullivan walked back into the cabin smiling. By gosh, that was smart work, he exclaimed. How the dickens did you know he was there? I saw his fingers as he pulled himself up, answered Biggles. Or rather, I saw the reflection of his fingers in that mirror. He pointed to a small square mirror on the opposite wall. He was in a good place, too, because not only could he hear every word we said, but he could see us, or our reflections, in the mirror without our seeing him. That's what made it so awkward. I didn't warn you by word or action for fear he bolted. All I could do was make a grab in the dark and hope for the best. Luckily, I managed to get him by the hair. What was he in, a boat? No, he was standing on a length of tree trunk. Paddled himself here beside it, I expect. There was a murmur outside the door, and a knock. It was then thrown open to admit the chief petty officer and two sailors, who between them held the prisoner by the arms, although his wrists had been handcuffed behind his back. He was stark naked and dripping wet. Small and thin, his skin was mottled with countless scars. Lank black hair hung halfway down his neck. Will you do the questioning? Invited Sullivan, looking at Biggles. Biggles nodded, and fixed his eyes on the bestial face. "What's your nationality?" he asked, speaking very distinctly. The man glowered and made no reply. "Come on, you can speak English." Not by a single sign did the prisoner betray that he understood. "Where have you come from?" Biggles called out sharply. The man only stared at him sullenly. Biggles nodded grimly. "I see. It's like that, is it?" Still the prisoner did not answer. "Very well," snapped Biggles. "Take him down below and tell the stokers if he doesn't talk to open the furnace and throw him in." The prisoner stirred uneasily, and his little eyes flashed from one to the other of his interrogators. "All right, take him away," said Biggles.
"No, I speak,"
gasped the prisoner. "You'd be well advised to do so," Biggles told him grimly. "My patience is at an end. Where do you come from?"
"Me stay Singapore,
"Where did you come from before that?"
Manila.
"I see. Who is your master?"
He no name.
"Where is he?" The man hesitated. "Come on."
He on junk.
"Where is the junk?" The prisoner's eyes switched nervously to the porthole, as if he feared he might be overheard.
The junk, he lay offside island, around headland.
"What is the junk doing in this sea?" Biggles asked crisply. The man screwed up his face.
Not know.
He answered earnestly. Biggles turned to Sullivan. "Have you any questions for him?" "No, I don't think so." As the prisoner was marched out, Biggles said, "I don't think we shall get any more information out of him, for the simple reason that he doesn't know what it's all about. I fancy he's just a deckhand sent over to listen because he knows a smattering of English. We shall do more good by having a closer look at this junk." "Absolutely," agreed the naval officer promptly. "Shall we move off right away?" Biggles pondered for a moment. "No, if it's agreeable to you, I'd rather put an armed party in the longboat and try to take the junk that way. If we creep along close to the shore, we might get right up to the junk without being spotted." "Right," agreed Sullivan. "How many men will you need?" "A score should be enough, with cutlasses and pistols." Within 10 minutes, the boat was on the water, creeping stealthily towards the shore. Biggles sat in the stern with Lovell, with Ginger just in front. Algy, much to his disgust, had been left behind with the Nemesis. In the pale light of a crescent moon, the silhouette of the island looked very beautiful. The sailors rowed without speaking, for conversation had been forbidden, and presently, rounding a headland, the bare masts and ungainly hulk of a junk came into view against the deep purple sky. "Easy all," said Biggles softly. The sailors rested on their oars. "Take it quietly, everyone, until I give the word. Then put your backs into it. The boarding party will avoid bloodshed if possible, but if we meet with resistance, use your weapons. Bosun, select 2 good men, and the instant you get aboard, make for the captain's quarters. It is important that he should not have a chance of destroying anything. Now then, gently does it." The boat moved forward over the smooth surface of the water, and they were not more than 100 yards from the junk, when a shrill cry warned them that they had been seen. "All right, my lads, let her go!" roared Biggles. Within a few seconds, the boat had run alongside the larger vessel, and the boarding party swarmed over the side, Biggles amongst them. There was a blinding flash and a deafening roar, and a sailor fell back into the boat, swearing fluently and clutching at his shoulder. Simultaneously, a clamour broke out above, shouts and screams punctuated by thuds and occasional shots. Ginger went up the side of the junk to join in the fray. All he could see at first was a confused melee, but presently he was able to make out that there was a certain amount of order about it, and that the sailors were driving the crew of the junk before them into the bows. Several of the enemy had deliberately dived overboard. The resistance was soon over, and Ginger followed Biggles and the boatswain below. In the corner of a large, well-furnished room, evidently the captain's cabin, stood a modern steel safe with its door wide open. Below it, on the ground, lay a number of papers. Nearby, a small dark man in blue uniform lay on the floor in a pool of blood. "A fool shot himself," said the boatswain. "Couldn't be helped," said Biggles quietly. "Pick up those papers, will you, and collect anything that's left in the safe. Make a thorough search of the room, and bring me any other papers you find. I shall be on deck." Ginger followed him, and at the head of the companionway they met Lovell. "I was just coming to fetch you," he exclaimed excitedly. "Come and take a look at this." The others followed him quickly to where a hatch, with its cover thrown aside, lay like a square of linoleum on the deck. "Cast your eyes down there," he invited them, as a torch flashed in his hand, the beam probing the depths of the hold. Biggles and Ginger, taking a pace forward, looked. There were 4 long steel tubes, about a foot in diameter, terminating in a point. "Torpedoes," said Biggles in a funny sort of whisper. "Yes," grinned Lovell, "and there are some cases of small arms ammunition in the forward hold, and shells that look like anti-aircraft tackle." Biggles glanced up to where the crew of the junk were huddled in the bows under the watchful eyes of the sailors. "Get those beauties below and batten them down," he suggested. "You remain here with your fellows, while I go back and have a word with Sullivan about this." 20 minutes later, he was telling the commander of the destroyer the result of the raid and what had been found on the junk. The documents from the safe, still unexamined, lay on the table. When he had finished, Sullivan's face was grave. "We're sailing in tricky waters, Bigglesworth," he said anxiously. "Goodness knows what might not happen if we make a blunder. But you can rely on me to stand by you to the bitter end." "Thanks, Sullivan," answered Biggles simply. "I know how you feel about the frightful responsibility of this thing. However, finding those torpedoes tells us that these enemy operations are no myth, and we're within a few miles of the headquarters of the organization. I said I'd find it and blot it out, and those are the lines on which I'm going to proceed, regardless of what the result may be. But first of all, we've got to dispose of the junk and its crew. I suggest we set them ashore here on this island. Maroon them. They wouldn't be able to leave until someone picked them up, by which time our show will all be over. And the junk? Bring one of the torpedoes aboard the Seafret for evidence in case it is ever needed, and then scuttle her." Sullivan nodded. "Yes, I think that's the best way," he agreed. Biggles picked up a chart that the chief petty officer had brought over with the other papers on the junk. "Aha! Aha! What's this?" he went on quickly, pointing to a number of fine lines that converged on a point amid a group of islands that he recognized instantly as part of the Magui archipelago. His eyes held a sparkle of triumph. "Elephant Island," he said quietly. "Looks like it," agreed the other. "That's all we want to know, isn't it?" "It would be if we were quite sure," answered Biggles cautiously. "Unfortunately, it might merely be a sub-depot at which the skipper of the junk had been ordered to deliver his goods. Before we dare strike, we've got to know that Elephant Island is, in fact, the base we are looking for." "How do you propose to do that?" "I don't know," answered Biggles frankly. "I shall have to think about it. How far are we away from the place?" 30 miles, I should say, at a rough guess." "That's plenty close enough to be healthy," declared Biggles. "I'll think things over. Perhaps it would be better to sleep on it and have another conference in the morning." "Right you are," agreed Sullivan. "By the way, what about the red seaplane?" "I know who made it," Biggles said softly. "But was there nothing on the pilot?" asked Sullivan. "There wasn't any pilot. The crocs got to him first." By the time the pink of dawn had turned to azure the following morning, the junk and its dead captain rested below the limpid waters of the bay,
and its crew were marooned on the island with enough stores for survival. "Have you decided what you're going to do?" Sullivan inquired of Biggles. "As I see it, we must get confirmation that Elephant Island is the place we're looking for. There are two ways in which we can do it. One is to fly over it, and the other is to tackle it from ground level. At first glance, the flying method might strike you as being the easier, but is it? Our friends will be watching the sky, that's certain, and a bunch of single-seater fighters could make things thundering uncomfortable for us. Even if they don't succeed in shooting us down, they would know from the very fact that we were flying over their hideout that we had spotted it. On the other hand, if by scouting on foot I could prove beyond all possible doubt that Elephant Island is the nest from which our ships have been sunk, the result would be quite different. They would not know they'd been spotted, and we should catch them red-handed, as it were. That's why I vote for the on-foot method. I'm going to Elephant Island, and I'm taking Ginger with me." "And what about me?" asked Algy. "Oh, there'll be a job for you, don't worry," Biggles told him. "Now listen, this is my idea. We lie low here until it gets dark, when the sea threat will take us, that is, the Nemesis, in tow to Hastings Island. We shall then be a lot nearer to Elephant Island than we are here. There is a lagoon with a good anchorage at the eastern end of Hastings Island that should suit us very well as a temporary base. It's rather close to the enemy, but I'm hoping that we shan't be there many hours. Anyway, it wouldn't do for the sea threat to drift about on the open sea, or the next thing we know will be a torpedo in her ribs." Biggles glanced at Sullivan, who nodded agreement. "Now, somebody has got to stay with the Nemesis, so it'll have to be you, Algy. As soon as it gets dark, the sea threat will steam slowly to within a mile of the southeast corner of Elephant Island, where she will lower a dinghy in which Ginger and I will row to one of the small islets shown on the chart here that almost touch the mainland. There we will find a hiding place. Then he will post me on the main shore, returning to his hiding place, and lie doggo until he gets my signal to come and fetch me. Naturally, the sea threat will return to Hastings Island as soon as she's dropped Ginger and me in the dinghy. So the position will be this. I shall be ashore, scouting. Ginger will be with the dinghy, hiding behind the islet, waiting to pick me up. You, Algy, will be at Hastings Island with the Nemesis, where the sea threat will rejoin you as soon as she can." "And after that?" asked Algy. "As soon as I discover what I hope to discover," went on Biggles, "I shall return to the beach and whistle for Ginger to come and pick me up, whereupon we return to the hiding place behind the islet and remain there all day. As soon as it gets dark, and before the moon rises, the sea threat will come back and pick us both up." "Then there's nothing I can do?" asked Algy. "I'm coming to that," answered Biggles. "Suppose something goes wrong. Suppose I got delayed on the island for some reason or other. You'd have to fly over and look for me. I couldn't ask Sullivan to charge round the island searching for me, but at a pinch you could do that, although you'd be taking a tidy risk. But it would be a big consolation for me to know that if for any reason I couldn't get back to the boat, there was a second string to our fiddle in the shape of the Nemesis." "Yes, I see that," admitted Algy, "but I can't help feeling that there are a lot of loose joints in this scheme." "I know. I'm not infatuated with it myself," confessed Biggles. "But we've got to know what's happening on Elephant Island. And we've got to know pretty soon. It won't be very long before the enemy will be wondering what's happened to the junk, which presumably was a supply ship." "Yes, I suppose you're right," agreed Algy doubtfully. "When is this programme due to start?" "This evening, as soon as it's dark. We're too close to the enemy's stronghold to start cruising about either on the water or in the air in broad daylight." "And suppose Elephant Island is the enemy's stronghold? What then?" asked Ginger. "Let's do one thing at a time," suggested Biggles. "That's always sound policy." Biggles was inclined to be taciturn as he leaned over the sea threat's rail, watching the inky waters glide past as the destroyer thrust her hatchet bows into the darkness in the direction of Elephant Island. Ginger, sensing his anxiety as he stood beside him, said nothing. Algy, as arranged, had been left behind with the Nemesis at the Hastings Island anchorage. Eventually, the barely perceptible vibration of the destroyer's engines ceased, and Sullivan joined them.
"Here we are," he said. "It's as black as pitch. I'm afraid you're going to find things rather difficult until the moon gets up. I've put a compass in the dinghy with a tin of food and a beaker of water." Biggles turned and walked slowly towards the davits where sailors were preparing to lower a small boat. "I shall expect you back about the same time tomorrow night," he told Sullivan quietly as he climbed into the suspended dinghy. "If it's very dark, I may have to whistle for you. We daren't risk showing lights. If you do see me show a light, you'll know things are pretty urgent." "Good enough. Best of luck," was the naval officer's farewell as the boat was lowered to the water. Biggles picked up an oar and pushed the dinghy clear, and for some time rowed in the darkness. Soon, a faint luminosity in the sky enabled them to see the black mass of Elephant Island and the rocky islet behind which they proposed to take cover. In no time their objective was at hand. The islet was just a mass of rock, oval in shape, perhaps 200 yards long and 40 or 50 feet wide. In most places, it was low enough to enable them to step straight ashore. The end farthest from the island rose gradually to a maximum height of about 10 or 12 feet. But the other end, which tapered considerably, curved round until the tip was not more than 30 to 40 yards from a spit of sand that jutted out from a beach on Elephant Island. They pulled the boat into a fairly deep indentation in the rock, and Biggles stepped ashore. "I think this place will suit us pretty well," he observed, glancing round. "The boat will ride here quite comfortably, while you sit on the rock and keep an eye open for me to come back." "Right you are," agreed Ginger. "Where do you want me to put you ashore?" "Anywhere on that beach will do," replied Biggles, regarding a little sandy cove that lay immediately opposite the islet. "There doesn't seem to be anyone about." A minute or two later, the keel of the dinghy grated quietly on the soft sand of Elephant Island. The moon was now flooding everything with its silvery light. The beach lay clear and white, with hardly a ripple to mark the waterline. But beyond it, and at each end, the jungle towered up steeply to the usual central eminence, black, vague, and forbidding. "Well, so long, laddie," he whispered softly, getting out. "Keep awake, don't show a light, and above all, don't make a noise." Then, with a cheery wave, he set off at a brisk pace along the beach. Ginger watched him until he was swallowed up in the dense shadows, and oppressed by a sudden pang of anxiety for Biggles, he rowed back slowly to the islet. He backed the dinghy into the tiny creek and stepped ashore. He took the painter, threw the end down near his feet, and settled himself down to await Biggles' return. A faint clicking noise made him turn to the seaward side of the islet, and he saw that hermit crabs on their ridiculous stilt-like legs were marching to and fro on the rock in small companies, for all the world like soldiers on parade. For a long while he watched them with interest, glancing from time to time at the beach, knowing that Biggles might return at any moment. But suddenly, the crabs were no longer there. The bony clicking of their long legs had ceased, and they had disappeared. A glance revealed the reason. He jumped to his feet with a startled cry. The dinghy had drifted unaccountably away from its berth. Already it was at the seaward end of the tiny creek, and seemed to be all lopsided, with a dark, indistinct mass hanging on the side of it. Then, as he stood staring with his heart thumping, there was a swish in the air, as of a rope when it is thrown. A dark, snake-like object curled through the air and fell with a soft thud across the rock on which he stood. He leapt backwards, an involuntary cry of horror breaking from his lips. In a panic, he ran towards the centre of the islet, until, reaching what seemed to be a safe place, he turned and looked again just in time to see the weight slide off the side of the dinghy and the boat right itself with a gentle splash. He sank down limply on the rock, wondering with a sort of helpless horror how he was going to recover the boat, now floating some 10 yards from the water's edge. To swim out for it, with that ghastly creature about, was unthinkable. He knew it was either an octopus or a decapod, perhaps the most loathsome living thing in all creation.
Then he saw something that once more put all thought of the boat out of his head. The creature was crawling out of the water onto the rock. For a second or two, the horror of it nearly overwhelmed him, for he could see its great pig-like body as large as a barrel, with 2 long tentacles protruding in front and a number of shorter ones behind. A decapod. It was all he could do to prevent himself from screaming. Then, farther down the islet, another of the creatures dragged itself out of the water. At the same time, the original decapod began to move slowly towards him, the 2 long tentacles groping with a soft, slithering noise over the rocks in front of it. In blind panic, he raced to the narrow end of the islet, nearest to the island. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw that the second horror had taken up the chase and heard its tentacles fall across the rocks behind him as he dashed past it. A swift glance backward revealed both monsters not 30 yards behind, moving swiftly over the ground in a sort of rolling motion. The sight drove the last vestige of control from his paralyzed faculties. He reached the absolute extremity of the islet, but he did not stop. A few yards away, another rock, quite small, rose clear out of the water, and he launched himself at it. The rock was covered with seaweed, and his feet shot away from under him, and he ricocheted into the water. He was up in a flash, catching his breath in a great gasp, and was overjoyed to discover that he could stand on what seemed a hard, sandy bottom. Instinctively, he made for Elephant Island, and almost before he was aware that he had reached it, he was racing up the firm, sandy beach to the softer sand beyond. Then, and not before, did he stop to look behind him. All was silent. Motionless and panting, he sank down onto the dry sand to recover his breath, clenching his hands to stop the trembling of his fingers, for the shock had left him weak and shaken. He brushed his hair back from his forehead impatiently and rose to his feet, peering in the direction of the islet in the hope of seeing the boat drift beyond the end of it. For his only chance of recovering it was, he knew, the rather forlorn one of a current or slant of air carrying it to the shore. Nothing would have induced him to go back into that monster-haunted water in the hope of retrieving it. It dawned upon him suddenly that, standing as he was in the middle of the white beach, he was exposed to the gaze of any living creature, human or animal, that might be prowling about, which in the circumstances was hardly wise. The end of the bay where Biggles had disappeared was not very far away, and as Biggles might reasonably be expected to return the same way as he had gone, he set off towards it. Presently, the sandy beach petered out, and gave way to a sloping shelf of rock that rose gradually to a cliff about 50 feet high, which continued along the foreshore and permitted a clear view of the beach, besides giving a fairly open aspect of the cliff along which Biggles had presumably gone. A little further along, a queer formation of small trees attracted Ginger's attention, and towards these he made his way, with the intention of taking up his stand amongst them, there to await Biggles' return. Accordingly, he turned his steps towards them. But it was not the trees themselves that made his eyes grow round with wonderment as he approached, but what lay on top of them. Across the lower forks of the trees, some 10 or 12 feet from the ground, had been laid other slender branches. Across these, at right angles, was a rough trellis work of smaller branches, while on top had been piled a great mass of twigs, not unlike a gigantic jackdaw's nest, rectangular and 2 or 3 feet wide. For some minutes he stood staring at this extraordinary phenomenon, completely perplexed. "Well, I give it up," he murmured, seating himself on a convenient boulder from which he could keep watch in both directions. It was a lonely vigil, and moreover, he was worried to death about what Biggles would have to say about the loss of the boat. From time to time, an unpleasant stench tainted the still night air so badly that a wave of nausea swept over him. He supposed that it was some sort of corruption in the forest. Suddenly, his vigil was disturbed by a sound that brought him to his feet with racing pulses. At first he could hardly believe his ears. It was the deep, steady throb of a powerful engine. In startled alarm, he turned swiftly, trying to locate the noise, but he could not. For a few unbelievable seconds, it seemed to beat against his feet, as though it were passing underneath him. Then, as though the door of an engine room had been opened, the sound was magnified 10 times and welled up behind him. He was round in an instant, prepared almost for anything except what he actually saw. Straight from the base of the low cliff on which he stood was emerging, very slowly, a black submarine, underway, heading out to the sea. The heads and shoulders of 2 men protruded from the circular superstructure, and a few words of a strange foreign language floated up to him. Out of sight, in silent wonderment, he watched the sinister craft, tense with the knowledge that the secret of the enemy's base was now his. Like a great fish, with its back awash, it held on its course, leaving a flashing wake of disturbed water behind it. Growing quickly smaller, as once clear of the islet, it increased its speed. The sound became a throbbing purr, then died away altogether, and the scene reverted to its former condition. When Biggles had left Ginger, he set off along the beach. What sort of country lay at the end of the little bay where the beach terminated, he did not know, but on reaching it, he found to his relief that the sand gave way to a rising rocky foreshore on which the jungle had only been able to fasten an insecure hold. Through this, he made fast time, keeping as near to the edge of the cliff as possible and stopping occasionally to listen. On the right was the sea, calm, silent, deserted, gleaming wanly in the eerie light of the young moon. To the left, the forest, dark, inscrutable, heavy with an atmosphere of menace. In this manner, he covered what must have been 3 or 4 miles, seeing and hearing nothing to arouse his suspicions. He noticed that the moon was now behind him, and he was able to estimate that he must have traversed nearly a quarter of the circumference of the island. Looking ahead, he saw that the cliff rose still higher. He paused at the point where the cliff sloped down, and somewhat to his surprise, found that it was possible to work inland by keeping to the most prominent outcrops of rock, and to his great satisfaction, the vegetation opened out instead of becoming more dense as he expected. And a quarter of an hour's hard work enabled him to reach the peak of a fairly considerable hill, from which he was able to make a comprehensive survey of the whole island and its coastline. It was with the coastline that he was particularly concerned, for a submarine base was hardly likely to be established anywhere except on the actual shore. But all he saw was a succession of beaches, screes, and cliffs. Well, that's that, he mused fatalistically, concealing his disappointment even from himself. This must just be a watering place or something of the sort. Well, I'd better see about getting back. He turned away from the tree against which he had been leaning at the precise moment that a perfectly aimed knife struck it with a vicious zip. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a number of figures take shape, flitting through the trees like shadows. He turned and sprinted down the hill towards the cliff like a hare. Dodging, twisting, ducking and jumping, he sped back along the way he had come, avoiding the numerous obstacles that crossed his path. Reaching a fairly open space just before the point where the cliff began to slope down to the beach, he risked a quick glance over his shoulder. What he saw made him redouble his efforts, for his pursuers were in a bunch not 50 yards behind. Biggles gathered himself for a final spurt and failed to see a loose rock that lay directly in his path. Stumbling and unable to save himself, arms outstretched, he crashed heavily to the ground. Ginger was still lying, staring out to sea at the point where the submarine had disappeared, when he heard voices, shouting, and the drumming beat of running footsteps coming in his direction. He didn't lose his head. He took the obvious course, which was to find a hiding place.
The huge nests on their prop-like supports suggested themselves immediately, and up the nearest one he went without further loss of time. He was conscious of an overpowering stench as he clambered up onto the structure at the top and lay flat. Soon the chase came into view. Sprinting along the lip of the cliff, jumping and swerving, came Biggles. After him, with the relentless determination of a pack of wolves, came a mob of some sort. Then, at the precise moment that Biggles drew level with the eyrie on which Ginger perched, he caught his foot against a rock and took such a header that a moan of horror burst from Ginger's dry lips. Unconsciously, he started forward. But the structure had not been designed for such treatment, for with a sharp, cracking noise, the whole thing began to slip. Ginger clutched at the sticks to save himself, and sent a number of them flying in all directions before he succeeded. His fingers closed over something soft, and simultaneously a stench at once so awful, so nauseating, filled his nostrils as he looked down to see what he was holding. Staring up at him was a face. A human face. It was in the advanced stages of decomposition, so utterly dreadful that any description of it would fail in its object. Ginger gave a cry of stark terror as he sprang upright, arms waving as he strove to balance himself. Then he jumped clear. Subconsciously, he was aware of a confused noise of shrieks and groans. Then he struck the ground. For a moment, he lay still, with the breath knocked out of him. Then he staggered to his feet, glaring wildly about him. Not a soul was in sight. The men were gone. He couldn't see Biggles. He seemed to be quite alone. He was still trying to comprehend that this was a fact when, without warning, his recent refuge collapsed completely, throwing its grisly tenant clear onto the rocks. With something between a moan and a yell, Ginger turned on his heel and made a beeline for the beach in stark panic. Rounding a corner, at the point where the rocks sloped down to the sand, he met head-on with somebody coming in the opposite direction, and collapsed with a crash into a convenient clump of bushes. Threshing and plunging like a salmon in a net, he fought his way out of the tangle, and then stopped dead, staring at Biggles, who was muttering under his breath and rubbing his knee. Ginger's relief was beyond words. "Come on, Biggles," he cried hoarsely. "Let's get out of this perishing place." "That's what I'm aiming to do," answered Biggles savagely. "Where's the boat?" Ginger faltered. It's gone." "Gone? Who took it?" "An octopus," explained Ginger. "Don't talk such blithering nonsense," snapped Biggles crossly. "Are you asking me to believe that an octopus got into our boat and rowed it away?" "No. You see—" "Just a minute," broke in Biggles. "Let me get this right. The boat's gone. Is that it?" "Exactly." "Fine," muttered Biggles grimly. "Now we know where we are. Let's get down to the beach, or anywhere away from here, in case these polecats come back." "I frightened them, didn't I?" asked Ginger, as they hurried down to the beach. "No. Oh, no. Frightened isn't the word. Suppose you were walking through a churchyard one night, and a corpse pushed its tombstone over and leapt out at you with a yell. Would you be frightened? I mean, you wouldn't stop to ask it questions." "No," declared Ginger emphatically. "Was that place a churchyard?" "What goes for one in these islands. They can't bury their dead in the earth in this rocky land, so they hoist them up into the trees. You must have found an empty grave." "Like fun I did," snorted Ginger. "He was at home all right. That yell you heard was me making his first acquaintance. Ugh!" "I don't wonder those fellows who were after me were scared," muttered Biggles, smiling at the recollection. They had reached the beach, but instead of following the waterline, they worked their way to the edge of the jungle and pulled up in the inky shade of a giant casuarina tree. "By the way," asked Ginger suddenly, "did you see any submarines?" Biggles looked at him sharply. "No, nor did I see any place where one might expect to find one." "I have," Ginger told him. Biggles started. "You've what?" he gasped. "Seen a submarine. Just along past the end of the bay, over there." Ginger pointed. "It came out of the cliff." "Out of it?" Talk sense.
I am. I tell you, I saw a submarine come out of the cliff and put out to sea.
Briefly, Ginger described how he had first heard and then seen the underwater craft, and followed this up by describing his adventures from the time the first decapod had dragged the boat away from the islet.
My gosh, you have had a night of it, muttered Biggles when he'd finished. So, what are we going to do? This is the place we're looking for, there's no doubt about that, but the information isn't going to be much use to us unless we find a way of getting back to our rendezvous. As soon as these Johnnies have recovered from their fright, they'll be back, and I don't like the look of the weapons they carry.
What sort of weapon is it?
There's a thing called a kris, a cross between a cutlass and a cleaver. Nasty.
How did you come to barge into them? Inquired Ginger.
In a few words, Biggles described his adventure. By the time he'd finished, the sky was beginning to turn grey, and he peered apprehensively along the beach.
It's beginning to get light, he muttered.
Let's see if there's any chance of getting the boat. If we can get onto the rising land farther along to the right, we ought to be able to see beyond the islet. Come on, and keep your eyes skinned. They set off along the beach, keeping as close to the edge of the jungle as possible, eventually plunging into the undergrowth in order to reach the top of the high ground of which he had spoken. The going was heavy, but in due course, panting and dishevelled, they reached the crest and looked down. A cry of triumph at once broke from Biggles' lips, for there, high and dry, on even keel, on the sand just round the headland, lay the dinghy. They set off downhill in the direction of the boat, and saw with relief that it was undamaged, with the oars still in place. Biggles thought swiftly. I must say I'm tempted to go and have a look at this place where the submarine came out. There must be a cave or a hidden creek there. How long will it take us to get there?
About 5 minutes. It's only just across the other side of the bay.
Come on then. Let's have a shot at it. They pushed the boat into the limpid water and scrambled aboard, and in a few seconds they were skimming towards their objective, keeping close into the shore to avoid observation. Reaching the far side of the bay, Biggles rested on his oars while the dinghy crept forward under its own way round the rocky headland. Not a cleft or a cave showed anywhere in the cliff. From the rank green vegetation 50 feet above to the turquoise ripples at their own level, the wall fell sheer without an unusual mark of any sort. Biggles looked at Ginger with questioning eyes.
Well, what do you make of it? He asked, a faint hint of scepticism in his voice. You're not going to try to persuade me that a submarine sailed straight through that chunk of rock?
Ginger shook his head.
No, he said. That's solid enough.
You're sure this is the right place?
Absolutely certain. In that case, it looks as if we've gone back to the age of miracles, declared Biggles sarcastically, dipping the oars into the water. We're going back to the islet. There's no sense sitting here gazing at a blank wall.
Biggles rowed back across the bay and took the dinghy behind the islet so that it was concealed from the main island.
Don't forget this place is alive with octopuses, warned Ginger.
Don't you mean octopi? Suggested Biggles.
What does it matter? Protested Ginger. Had you been here last night, you wouldn't have stopped to consult your pocket dictionary, I'll bet. It'll be safe enough during the daylight. What about when it gets dark?
We shall be gone by then, answered Biggles. Let's haul the dinghy ashore. We can forget about it then, and pass the day in the shade of that rock. He nodded towards the mass of rock that rose at the higher end of the islet. The rest of the day was in the nature of a picnic. After a lunch from the food and water in the dinghy, they slept in turn, one keeping watch while the other rested. They saw or heard nothing. As the sun began to sink behind the western horizon, Biggles said, "The fact is, Ginger, you didn't see a submarine at all. You only thought you saw one. It looks to me—"
Truth! What's that?
An aero engine roared, almost in their ears it seemed, and peeping round a rock, they beheld a sight so inexplicable that they could only stare speechlessly. Floating on the blue surface of the translucent water at the far end of the bay was a small seaplane. How it had got there without being heard or seen was a mystery that defied all logical conjecture. With a roar, the aircraft sped across the water in a cloud of glittering spray and soared into the sky.
What do you know about that? Gasped Biggles.
About what?
That seaplane.
Seaplane?
You didn't see a seaplane. You only thought you saw one, mocked Ginger, getting his own back for Biggles' jibe earlier.
They watched the machine until it was a mere speck in the blue. Then the hum of the engine died away suddenly, before they saw it coming down again.
He's been up for an evening reconnaissance, I should say, observed Biggles quietly. Maybe he was looking for the junk.
Out of the corners of their eyes, they watched the machine glide in, kiss the water, and run to a stop not 50 yards from the cliff. There was a bellow of sound as the engine roared again, and the machine disappeared behind the headland. The noise of the engine ceased, and they waited for it to start again, but in vain. Silence settled over the scene, now mauve-tinted with the approach of twilight. Biggles started collecting the belongings that were scattered about at their feet.
"We're moving off," said Biggles quietly. "That suits me," said Ginger warmly. "It's getting near octopus time."
"I'm going to have another look at that cliff." Just what he expected to find, Biggles did not say. But he expressed no surprise when the dinghy rounded the headland, and the secret of the seaplane's disappearance was explained, as was the case of the submarine. Gaping in the face of the cliff, low down on the waterline, was a great black hole like the mouth of a tunnel.
"Of course," grunted Biggles disgustedly. "A cave, exposed at low water, but submerged at high tide. It was high water when we came round here this morning. Well, we've got the secret now, and it's up to us to pass it back to Sullivan before we take any more risks, so that he can send the information back to the people at home in case anything unpleasant happens to us. After we've done that, we'll come back and have a snoop round, because then our precious lives won't be of such vital importance if we get into a jam." "You speak for yourself," growled Ginger.
Biggles laughed softly as he pulled on the oars, and the island faded into the dark background. In the pitch darkness, with nothing to do once they'd reached their rendezvous, the time seemed to pass slowly.
"Time Sullivan was here," muttered Biggles at last, staring into the gloom to seaward.
Another quarter of an hour passed, and Biggles stirred uneasily.
"Funny," he said, as if to himself. "I suppose we couldn't by any chance have missed him."
Ginger said nothing. Another half an hour or so elapsed.
"I don't think it's much use waiting here any longer," Biggles announced bitterly. "Something's gone wrong. Sullivan isn't coming, or he'd be here by now."
Ginger crouched forward in a rigid attitude, listening tensely.
"I can hear something. What is it?"
From somewhere out to sea, a deep drone pulsed through the night. For a moment or two it persisted, rising to a crescendo, and then died away. A moment later the sound was repeated, and then again, slightly louder.
"What does that sound like to you?" asked Biggles in an odd tone of voice. "I should say it was a marine aircraft, taxiing over water," replied Ginger slowly.
Yes, I think you've hit the nail on the head, agreed Biggles. It's algae. Taxiing here to fetch us. Something has happened to the destroyer. By gosh, I hope you're wrong for once, muttered Ginger anxiously. Well, we shall see, was Biggles' pessimistic reply. One thing is certain. It's an aircraft, and if it isn't algae, we shall shortly be up Salt Creek without a paddle. The sound drew nearer, and it was quite easy to follow what was happening. Someone was sitting in the cockpit of an aircraft, opening up the engine and easing back the throttle each time the machine gathered way. "We don't want him to run us down," exclaimed Biggles, suddenly rising to his feet. He waited for one of the intermittent silences, and then, cupping his hands round his mouth, let out a moderately loud hail. A call answered them immediately. They recognized Algy's voice and rowed towards it, and a minute later the dark silhouette of the Nemesis loomed up in front of them. Biggles urged the dinghy forward until its bow was just below the cockpit. Algy's head appeared over the side. "Hello," he said, switching off the engines. "Hello yourself," returned Biggles grimly. "Where's the Seafret?" "She was torpedoed this morning. At least, that's what it looked like." Biggles turned stone cold. Good heavens! Was she sunk? No. Sullivan managed to beach her. The Seafret was anchored in the little bay at Hastings Island. I taxied the machine onto the beach and was giving her a look over when I was nearly knocked flat by an explosion. When I looked up, I saw a cloud of smoke hanging over the destroyer. She'd already taken on a bad list. Sullivan slipped his cable and ran her straight ashore, not 50 yards from where I was. "No lives lost?" "No." "Thank God for that. What's Sullivan doing?" "Sitting on the beach cursing, mostly. They've got plenty of stores ashore and have made a camp." "By heaven, these people must be pretty desperate. Anyone would think that they were deliberately trying to start a war." "Not necessarily," replied Algy. "As Sullivan said, who's to say it was a torpedo? Nobody saw anything, either before or after the explosion. If he said he'd lost his ship because she'd been torpedoed in peacetime, the Admiralty would laugh at him. We don't know whom to accuse of doing it anyway." "That's true enough," admitted Biggles. "Has he called for assistance by wireless?" "No. We decided that the enemy would pick up the SOS as well as our own people, so it might be better to lie low for a day or two. We came to the conclusion that the first thing for me to do was to fetch you." "Quite right," agreed Biggles. "Did you see anything of the submarine yourself?" "Not a thing. They just landed a mouldy into the destroyer and made off. Now, if you'll get aboard, we'll see about getting back." "Just a minute." "Not so fast," protested Biggles. "I'm not coming back with you." "You're not?" "No." "What are you going to do?" "Stay here. Listen, this is how things stand. Memorize what I say, because you may have to repeat it to Sullivan. Elephant Island is the place we've been looking for. In the central face of rock, almost opposite us now, there is a cave, and inside there are submarines and aircraft. The entrance is covered at high water, so whatever we do will have to be done at low tide. This is my idea. The tide is down now. As soon as the moon comes up, Ginger and I will get into the dinghy and go and have a look at this underground water depot. You get behind the islet so that you can't be seen from shore, but don't get too close to the rock, or you might find an octopus in the cabin when you go to take off. And don't make more noise than is necessary. Well, how does that strike you as a program?" Algy hesitated. "I can't say that I'm exactly enamoured of it," he confessed, dubiously. "There is no alternative," declared Biggles. "The whole Far East fleet of the Royal Navy could hammer away at the island for weeks without hurting the submarine merchants. More direct methods will be demanded. But until we know just what we've got to destroy, it's difficult to know how to apply them." "Yes, I see that," admitted Algy. "But what is Sullivan going to think when we don't turn up?" "He'll have to think what he likes, and hope he won't do anything desperate." "All right," agreed Algy. "If you're satisfied, then it's okay by me. Let's get the Nemesis to this islet you talk about." "Throw me a line. We'll tow the machine there. It isn't far. I'd rather you didn't start the engines again." The moon rose as they towed the Nemesis into position behind the high shoulder of rock. "Has anyone got the time?" asked Biggles, as the Nemesis dropped her small anchor in 30 feet of water. "Just on midnight," answered Algy, glancing at his instrument board. "Right," said Biggles. "We'll move off an hour before dawn. That's the best time to catch people napping. So we'll wait for a bit. Pass me down a torch." Algy handed down a small electric torch. "Anything else?" he asked. "No, I think that's everything. We've got guns, but I hope we won't need them." A few hours later, he embarked on one of the most desperate adventures of his career. A gentle breeze caused the water to ripple softly against the prow of the dinghy as, under the stealthy impetus of the oars, it edged round the headland and approached the cave. Soon they sat staring into a cavity that was as black as the mouth of a pit. Neither spoke, knowing full well that in such conditions the sound of the human voice travels far. An even pull on the oars, and they were inside the void, swallowed up in such a darkness as Ginger had never before experienced. It was the darkness of total blindness. A gentle click, and from the centre of the boat sprang a beam of light that cut through the air like a solid white cone as Biggles switched on the torch. Further progress without illumination of some sort was, he felt, quite useless, if not impossible. The light revealed nothing except a semicircular arch of rock, with a floor of still, silent water, which appeared to run straight into the very heart of the island. There was another click as Biggles switched off the light, and a moment later Ginger felt the boat moving forward again. It was an eerie sensation, gliding through space in such conditions. The only sound was the faint swish of the oars as they dipped in and out of the water. But after some minutes the side of the dinghy grated gently on the rough wall. Thereafter progress was slower, for rather than switch on the light again, Biggles began to maintain a forward movement by using his fingers against the wall, taking advantage of any slight projection that he could feel. As soon as he realized what was happening, Ginger joined in the task. It was difficult to estimate how far they travelled in this manner, but it must have been several minutes later when a half circle of wan blue light appeared, and they realized that it was the end of the tunnel. The strain of the next few minutes was so intense that Ginger clutched at the gunwale of the boat to steady his trembling fingers. With infinite slowness, the boat floated until it was possible to see through an opening at what lay beyond. At first, it was rather difficult to make out just what it was, but as they gazed, section by section of the scene unfolded itself. Biggles realized instantly that he was looking into the crater of a long-extinct volcano, now filled with water which had come through from the sea, presumably by the same channel through which they themselves had come. The island itself must have been the actual peak of the volcano, which, with the cooling of the molten mass, had remained hollow. The sides of the crater dropped sheer from heights varying from 150 feet to sea level, where the water began. At one place, the wall had crumbled away until the slope could easily be scaled, and was the path by which the submarine crews travelled to and from their quarters, which were situated halfway up the cliff. The dark bulk of a submarine rested motionless against a rough quay at the base of the incline. Biggles realized that even if he had flown over the island and seen the gleam of water, he would merely have taken it for a lake, for the buildings, being built of the actual rock which formed the sides of the crater, would certainly have escaped detection. These buildings he now examined with the practised eye of an aerial observer. No lights were showing. There were 4 buildings in all. The lowest 3 were long, squat structures, evidently living quarters or storerooms. The top one, however, perched almost on the lip of the crater, was much smaller, square in shape, with antennae of a wireless aerial outlined like a spider's web against the moonlit sky. The only other object on the water, besides the submarine, was a seaplane which floated near the foot of the path just beyond the underwater craft. It was easy to see how it was employed. It could not, of course, take off from the crater, but with its wings folded, could easily pass through the tunnel to the open sea, where, with its wings rigged in flying position, It could operate at will. There seemed to be nothing else worthy of note, and Biggles was about to turn away when Ginger touched him on the elbow and pointed to a narrow cleft or opening in the rock wall not more than a few yards from where they sat. A slight pull on the oars, and they passed through the gap and were staring with astonished eyes at what met their gaze. The place seemed to be a secondary crater, not much larger in area than a fair-sized house, but in this case the walls were perpendicular. On the surface of the water were round, buoy-like objects, with horns projecting at different angles, which could only be mines such as are used in naval warfare. Packed on ledges of rock was a vast array of metal cylinders with pointed ends, easily recognized as shells. Not only was the place a submarine depot, but also a naval armory, an armament stores depot capable of supplying a fleet with material, to say nothing of laying a minefield around itself for its own protection. And the concentration of stores was apparently still proceeding, harmless-looking junks being used for the purpose. There was another dark area at the far end of the tiny crater, which looked as if it might reveal further secrets. But Biggles had seen enough. His one concern now was the destruction of the whole concern. His eyes swept over the sinister-looking mines for the last time, and his oars were already in the water for immediate departure, when an idea flashed into his head, so audacious that for a moment it took his breath away. There was a submarine outside. Ginger had seen it go out. It could not have come back without their seeing it or hearing it. It might return at any time. One mine in the tunnel. "What's the idea?" whispered Ginger, who was watching him closely. "I'm going to lay one of those mines in the tunnel," declared Biggles, in the incisive tones he always used when he was keyed up for action. "Hang on while I see if these pills are fastened together. Don't run the boat against one of those spikes, or we shall take a flight through space into eternity." The mines were, Biggles quickly ascertained, merely roped together at intervals to prevent them bumping against each other, and with far less trouble than he expected, he untied one, and then ordered Ginger to hang on to it while he picked up the oars. Ginger obeyed promptly, but without enthusiasm, and leaning over the stern, got his hand through the iron ring attached for that purpose, and in this position was rowed by Biggles back into the tunnel. "Be careful you don't barge into the wall," warned Ginger nervously. "It's all right," replied Biggles. "You can let it go now. I hate the sight of these things as much as you do. 2 minutes, and we shall be out." Ginger released his dangerous charge with a deep sigh of relief, and could have shouted with joy when a moment later, with Biggles bending to the oars, the entrance of the tunnel came into view. He was watching the pale grey opening become lighter as they drew nearer to it, when to his surprise it was suddenly blotted out. At the same moment, a deep, vibrant roar filled the tunnel, and he knew what it was. "It's the submarine! She's coming in!" Biggles gasped out something and, whirling the dinghy round, set off back down the tunnel with all the power in his arms. A light flashed from the bows of the submarine and illuminated the cave as brightly as daylight. Biggles did not stop. In his frantic haste, he forgot all about the mine, and Ginger let out a shrill cry of horror as they missed it by a foot, their wake setting it bobbing and rolling in the middle of the fairway. "Keep your head. I'm going to make for the quay. It's our only chance. Try and keep together. We've got to get up that path. Use your gun if anyone tries to stop you." They shot through the end of the tunnel into the moonlit crater. Then, with a roar like the end of the world, from the mouth of the tunnel belched a great sheet of flame. Then something seemed to come up under the dinghy and carry it forward with the speed of a racing motor launch, and before anything could be done to prevent it, the dinghy had crashed into the undercarriage of the seaplane with such force that the top was ripped clean off one of the floats. The dinghy began to sink at once. Ginger grabbed at the undamaged float and managed to drag himself across it. Biggles fell into the water, but managed to seize the end of the damaged float, to which he hung. The water boiled and heaved and foamed as, flung into a maelstrom by the explosion, it dashed itself against the cliff, only to be hurled back in a smother of spray to meet a wave receding from the opposite wall. The heavy submarine was rocked like a cork, rolling its metal plates against the quay with an appalling grinding noise, while the lightly floating seaplane reared and bucked and threw itself about like a newly roped wild horse. Fortunately, this state of affairs did not last long, and once the first shock had passed, the miniature tornado began quickly to subside. But on the shore, if shore it could be called, things were happening. Lights appeared everywhere. From the 3 lower buildings, men began to run down to the quay nearest to the cave, talking and gesticulating as they tried to ascertain the cause of the explosion. Presently, when they'd all collected there, Biggles realized that no better opportunity of escape would ever be likely to present itself. "Ginger," he said, "I'm going to make a dash for the top of the hill while these stiffs are all down on the quay. It's our only chance. If we can make the top, we might, by taking to the jungle, get back to Algy. Are you ready?" "Okay, Chief." "Come on, then." They released their hold on the seaplane and swam the few yards to the nearest point where they could effect a landing. At first, their luck held. They dragged themselves ashore like dripping water spaniels, and had actually succeeded in getting above the quay before one of the men turned sharply and looked at them. He called out something that made several of the others look. Then, with one accord, they started up the path. Biggles and Ginger started to run, and the chase began in earnest. Above, the sky was already grey, flushed with the pink rays of dawn. The climb would have been a stiff one at the best of times, being sharply sloping rock for the most part, with hand-hewn steps occurring in the worst places, and before they'd gone far, both Biggles and Ginger were breathing heavily. Rounding a shoulder of rock in which a flight of steps had been cut, Biggles saw something that brought a shout of satisfaction to his lips. Beside the path was a stack of detritus, pieces of rock of all shapes and sizes, just as it had been cut out in the construction of the steps. He was on it in a flash, kicking and pushing with hands and feet. Ginger joined him, and a minor avalanche of rocks and dust went bouncing and sliding down the path. There was a yell from below as their pursuers saw what was happening and dashed for cover, which was precisely what Biggles wanted, for it gave them a fresh start, of which they were not long taking advantage. "We've done it!" he gasped as they burst round the last bend, and saw that they were not more than 20 yards from the top, with the enemy a good 40 or 50 yards behind. But he spoke too soon. Over the brow of the cliff poured a stream of Dyaks, armed with their native weapon, the kris, which can take a man's head from his shoulders as cleanly as a guillotine. There seemed to be only one hope left, and Biggles swerved towards it. The wireless building, a rock-built structure with a heavy door. With Ginger facing the mob, gun in hand, Biggles tried the door. It opened easily, and they both burst inside. 2 men, Oriental in appearance, in gold-braided uniforms, who had been sitting at the desk in front of modern wireless equipment, sprang to their feet as the 2 airmen burst in. For one instant they stared. Then one pulled open a drawer and whipped out a revolver. Biggles' pistol spoke first, and the man crumpled like an empty sack. The other darted round the desk, getting to the door. Biggles quickly snapped, "All right, let him go." Ginger stood aside, and the man disappeared. Biggles slammed the door behind him, and slipped the bolt with which it was fitted. Then, with his back to it, his eyes swept the room. "Can you handle that set?" he rapped out. "I don't see why not," answered Ginger, reaching the apparatus in 3 quick strides. "Then try and get Singapore." "Usual wavelength," Biggles told him tersely. "As soon as you get 'em, let me know. If the sea fret interferes, tell the operator to listen but not jam the air." As he finished speaking, Biggles threw up his automatic and blazed at a face that appeared at the window near the door.
One of the panes flew to fragments and the face disappeared. Ginger, with the earphones clipped on his head, was already revolving the black vulcanite controls. Biggles took up his position facing the window, pistol ready for snap shooting. There was a short silence. Occasionally, a dark figure flashed past the window, but Biggles held his fire. If he could hold the place until he got a message through to Singapore, he didn't care much what happened after that. There came a crash on the door that made the whole building shake. "Any luck?" Biggles asked Ginger quietly. "I've got Seafret. Strongly, too." "Right. Give this message to Sullivan and ask him to transmit it as quickly as possible," said Biggles, taking a map from his pocket and studying it for a second or two. Then, using the pencil dropped by the operator, he wrote swiftly on a message block, disregarding the attack on the door, which was now being prosecuted with increasing vigour. When he had finished, he pushed the slip over to Ginger, picked up his pistol again, and resumed guard over the window. It was well that he did so, for at that moment an arm, holding a revolver, appeared through the broken glass. But before the man could fire, Biggles blazed at it from point-blank range. There was a yell outside. The revolver fell inside the room, and the arm was withdrawn. "Okay," called Ginger. "Sullivan's got the story, and I've told him where we are." "That's fine. Tell him to get through to Singapore as quickly as he can." Ginger returned to his task, but a moment later looked at Biggles with puzzled eyes. "That's funny," he exclaimed. "I was speaking to Seafret when the operator cut in and said, 'Hang on, stand by,' and the instrument went stone dead. I can't get a kick of any sort out of it." "They must have cut the lead-in wire outside," answered Biggles, without taking his eyes from the window. "I wonder what Seafret meant by asking us to stand by. And I should like to know what's going on outside. They seem to have stopped banging on the door. I suppose we can't hold out until the RAF machines arrive?" Biggles shook his head. "No," he said. "They'll be hours. In any case, the last place we want to be when they start doing their stuff is here. Believe me, life won't be worth living." As he finished speaking, he snatched a quick glance through the window. "My goodness," he gasped. Not 10 yards from the door, and pointing towards it, was a machine gun on a tripod, a metal belt of ammunition hanging out of it like a long, flat centipede. There was nothing surprising about that, but he certainly did not expect it to be deserted. A little farther down the path, a large party of men were dragging a much heavier gun into position. Scattered about the rocks, watching the proceedings, were others, mostly officers, judging by their uniforms. Biggles made up his mind with the speed and precision that comes from long experience in the air. "Keep me covered," he snapped. With that, he unfastened the door, flung it wide open, and raced to the machine gun. This was the very last thing the people outside expected. One does not look to a rabbit to leave its burrow voluntarily when a pack of terriers is waiting outside. On the face of it, it was sheer suicide. But as so often happens in the case of unorthodox tactics, it was in this very factor that its highest recommendation lay. All eyes were on the heavy gun, and the ill-assorted team working on it, when he made his dash, which was all to Biggles' advantage, and he actually reached the machine gun before he was seen. In the twinkling of an eye, he had swung the muzzle in the opposite direction and squatted down behind it, thumbs on the double thumb piece. There was no need to take aim. The target was large and the range point-blank. Jabbing yellow flames leapt from the muzzle, and before the stream of lead, the crowd disappeared like a waft of smoke in a high wind. Those who had been hit lay where they had fallen. The others raced for cover. Biggles did not confine his attention entirely to the main body of the enemy. From time to time, he slewed the barrel round and raked the surrounding rocks behind which the spectators had taken cover, and the scream of ricocheting bullets seemed to intensify the volume of fire. Suddenly, the noise broke off short, and he knew that the belt was exhausted. "Come on!" he yelled to Ginger, and made a dash for the jungle not a score of paces distant. Ginger followed.
For a short distance, they followed a narrow path through the bush, knowing that they would be pursued by the Dyaks. Within the forest, the matted treetops met over their heads, shutting out the sunlight, while below, the secondary growth made the going difficult. After the recent noise and commotion, it all seemed very still and quiet. But Biggles was not deceived. He knew that somewhere, not far away, the enemy would be seeking them. "We must try to get down to the beach," said Biggles breathlessly. "I only pray that Algy is still sitting tight behind the islet. Come on, keep going. Hello? What's that? Listen." From somewhere not far behind them, a wild shout had echoed through the trees, to be followed immediately by others and the swish of undergrowth. The Dyaks had found their trail and were in hot pursuit. Neither of them would ever forget the next 10 minutes. The flight resolved itself into a delirium of whirling branches and swaying palm fronds. Once they plunged through a mire in which several crocodiles were wallowing, but the creatures were evidently as startled as they were, for they crashed into the bushes, leaving the way clear. On the far side, the ground sloped steeply down towards the sea, which they could now see from time to time through the foliage. Down towards it they plunged, slipping, sliding, falling, rolling, grabbing at any handhold to steady themselves. Occasionally they heard crashes in the bush perilously close behind them. They burst out of the forest a few hundred yards from the gaunt uprights of the elevated cemetery which straddled the rocks near the edge of the cliff. And as they swung towards them, Biggles grabbed Ginger's arm, pointing to seaward. "Great heavens! What on earth is all that?" he gasped. He need not have pointed, for Ginger had already seen them, a dozen or more machines in arrowhead formation, the point directed towards the island. "They're wildebeests!" he yelled exultantly as he saw the blunt noses and queerly humped backs of the aircraft. "How on earth did they?" "Never mind how they got there. Keep going," panted Biggles, as the Dyaks began to stream out of the jungle with a shout as they viewed their quarry. To Biggles and Ginger, the appearance of the RAF machines was miraculous. It was quite certain that they could not have come from Singapore in the time that had elapsed since they had signalled the sea threat, but there was no time to ponder the mystery. The Dyaks were gaining on them, and the beach was still nearly a quarter of a mile away. As they reached the cemetery, a kriss flashed past Biggles' shoulder, and he knew that to continue running was to court disaster. Subconsciously, he was aware of the wildebeests nosing down towards the centre of the island, and he knew that whatever happened now, their mission had been successful. In a sort of savage exultation, he drew his automatic and whirled round. Ginger's gun took up the story. The Dyaks split up as they dodged for cover, and at that moment the first bomb burst. Biggles and Ginger sped on and reached the place where the rocks sloped down to the bay. Ginger let out a yell as the Nemesis came into view. She skimmed across the surface of the water towards them as her keel touched the sandy bottom near the beach. They saw the propellers slow down, then Algy dive into the cabin, to reappear with the machine gun, which he balanced on the windscreen. But that was all they saw, for at that moment, the whole island seemed to blow up. Ginger afterwards swore that the ground lifted several inches under his feet, and Biggles admitted that he had never heard anything quite like it, not even during the war. The force of it threw both Biggles and Ginger off their feet, and they finished the last 20 yards of the slope in something between a roll and a slide. Shaken, and not a little dazed, they made their way to the Nemesis. "If sounds are anything to go by, you've been having a lovely time," observed Algy. "Not so bad," grinned Biggles. "Where in thunder did all this aviation start from?" Algy shrugged his shoulders. "Don't ask me," he answered shortly. Then, with a puzzled expression, he pointed to the jungle-clad hillside. "What's that?" Biggles and Ginger turned and looked. From the centre of the island, a pale green transparent cloud writhed and coiled in slow turgid waves down the hillside towards the sea. As it rolled, and in silence embraced the forest, the foliage of the trees turned to yellow, and the emerald of the palm crests to dingy white. Biggles turned very pale and shouted one word.
Gas!
Almost before the word had died on his lips, the three of them were falling into their places in the aircraft faster than they had ever embarked in their travels. Within a minute, the Nemesis was tearing across the water, flinging behind her a line of swirling foam. "Where to?" asked Algy. "The sea fret," answered Biggles, glancing down through the green miasma at the flagging desolation of what had, a few minutes before, been a living forest.
"We'd better have a word or two with Sullivan."
20 minutes later, the Nemesis taxied up to the beach near the stranded destroyer, where the ship's officers awaited them in a little group. From the far distance, Biggles could see the formation of wildebeests heading towards the island. He pointed to them, at the same time turning to the commander of the Seafret. "Sullivan," he said, "can you satisfy my curiosity by telling me just how it happened that these aeroplanes arrived at this particular spot so opportunely?" The commander smiled. "That's easy," he answered. "I fetched them here." "You didn't suppose it was a fluke, did you?" Biggles scratched his head. "I didn't know what to think, and that's a fact," he confessed. "You certainly had a brainwave. What caused it?" "The simple fact that Lacey didn't return. It seemed to be the last straw, our only mobile unit going west, as I thought. So the only thing to do was to get in touch with RAF headquarters at Singapore and ask for assistance for both myself and you. Squadron leader Gore Alliston landed here with his pack of airhounds, and just as I was telling him the story, your message came through. Naturally, Gore Alliston took off for Elephant Island at once. I hope he did his stuff all right." "He certainly did," agreed Biggles gravely. "There isn't a living creature left on the island, I'll warrant. Human being, crocodile, or mosquito." Sullivan's face expressed incredulity. "They're gassed, the lot of them," explained Biggles. "I didn't know our fellows carried gas bombs nowadays." Sullivan shook his head. "They don't. But I can hazard a guess as to what happened. The wildebeests were carrying ordinary 112-pound high-explosive bombs, and they must have hit the enemy's gas shell dump." "Gas shells? Where did you get that idea?" "When we torpedoed the junk, my gunnery officer brought a shell or two as well to try and find out the name of the firm who was supplying them. He tells me that they are all gas shells." "Jumping crocodiles, do you mean to tell me that those skunks were going to use gas shells if it came to a scrap?" Sullivan nodded grimly. "Then it serves them jolly well right that they've got hoisted with their own blinking petard," declared Biggles savagely. He turned to watch the wildebeests land on the bay. "What are you going to do now?" asked Sullivan. Biggles glanced over his shoulder. "I suppose they're sending a ship to pick you up?" he asked. "Yes, a destroyer is on the way." "In that case, I'm going to hit the breeze for home," Biggles told him. "The people who sent us out on this jaunt will be anxious to know exactly what is happening." "You're not going without telling us what happened on the island," protested Sullivan. Biggles looked pained. "My dear chap, I wouldn't dream of doing such a thing. How about a quiet spot of dinner tonight, to celebrate the occasion? I can tell you all about it then." 10 days later, early in the evening, the door of the sitting room in Biggles' flat opened, and Biggles walked in. He glanced at Algy and Ginger, who looked as though they'd been expecting him. "Well, come on out with it," growled Ginger. "What did he say?" Biggles frowned. "You mustn't call the Foreign Secretary a he." "I'll call you something worse than that if you don't tell me what he said," grinned Ginger. "Very well, since you must know. He said thank you. Or to be absolutely accurate, thank you very much." "Is that all? What did you expect? Did you suppose he was going to kiss me? No. But after what we've done, he might have done something, given us a gold watch apiece, for instance." Biggles shook his head. "The government doesn't express its thanks by doling out gold watches," he answered seriously. "When you've worked for the government as long as I have, you'll know that virtue is expected to be its own reward." "Well, if that's all, we might as well go out and buy ourselves a bite of dinner," declared Algy, rising.
No need to do that, replied Biggles, smiling. Lord Lottison has been kind enough to ask us all to dine with him, at his house, in order that certain members of the Cabinet may learn at first hand just what transpired during the operations of His Majesty's aircraft Nemesis in the Straits of the Magui Archipelago. Go and put on your best bibs and tuckers, and look sharp about it. Cabinet ministers don't like to be kept waiting.